Chapter I French Materialism of the 18th Century, IFU Nowadays, says Mr. Mikhailovsky, 1-meter young man, who, even with some unnecessary haste, informs you that he is a materialist. This does not mean that he is a materialist in the general philosophical sense, in which in olden days we had admirers of Vichna and Moleschott. Very often the person with whom you are talking is not in the least interested either in the metaphysical or in the scientific side of materialism, and even has a very vague idea of them. He wants to say that he is a follower of the theory of economic materialism, and that in a particular and conditional sense. We do not know what kind of young men Mr. Mikhailovsky has been meeting, but his words may give rise to the impression that the teaching of the representatives of economic materialism has no connection with materialism in the general philosophical sense. Is that true? Is economic materialism really so narrow and poor in content as it seems to Mr. Mikhailovsky? A brief sketch of the history of that doctrine will serve as a reply. What is materialism in the general philosophical sense? Materialism is the direct opposite of idealism. Idealism strives to explain all the phenomena of nature, all the qualities of matter, by these or those qualities of the spirit. Materialism acts in the exactly opposite way. It tries to explain spiritual phenomena by these or those qualities of matter, by this or that organization of the one N.K. Mikhailovsky, human or, in more general terms, of the animal body. All those philosophers in the eyes of whom the prime factor is matter belong to the camp of the materialists. And all those who consider such a factor to be the spirit are idealists. That is all that can be said about materialism in general, about materialism in the general philosophical sense as time built up on its fundamental principle the most varied superstructures, which gave the materialism of one epoch quite a different aspect from the materialism of another. Materialism and idealism exhaust the most important tendencies of philosophical thought. True, by their side there have almost always existed dualist systems of one kind or other, which recognize spirit and matter as separate and independent substances. Dualism was never able to reply satisfactorily to the inevitable question, how could these two separate substances, which have nothing in common between them, influence each other? Therefore the most consistent and most profound thinkers were always inclined to monism, that is to explaining phenomena with the help of some one main principle. Monos in Greek means one. Every consistent idealist is a monist to the same extent as every consistent materialist. In this respect there is no difference, for example, between Berkeley and Holbach. One was a consistent idealist, the other a no less consistent materialist, but each was to the same degree a monist. Both one and the other equally well understood the worthlessness of the dualist outlook on the world, which up to this day is still, perhaps, the most widespread. In the first half of our century one philosophy was dominated by idealistic monism. In its second half there triumphed in science with which meanwhile philosophy had been completely fused materialistic monism, although far from always consistent and frank monism. We do not require to set forth here all the history of materialism. For our purpose it will be sufficient to consider its development beginning with the second one, that is the 19th century. Half of last century. And even here it will be important for us to have in view, for the most part, one of its tendencies true, the most important namely, the materialism of Holbach, Helvetius and their supporters. The materialists of this tendency waged a hot polemic against the official thinkers of that time who, appealing to the authority of Descartes, whom they can hardly have well understood, asserted that man has certain innate ideas, that is such as appear independently of his experience. Contesting this view, the French materialists in fact were only setting forth the teaching of Locke, who at the end of the 17th century was already proving that there are no innate principles. But setting forth his teaching, the French materialists gave it a more consistent form, putting the dots over such I's as Locke did not wish to touch upon, being a well-bred English liberal. The French materialists were fearless sensationalists, consistent throughout, that is they considered all the spiritual functions of man to be variations of his sensations. It would be valueless to examine here to what extent, in this or that particular case, their arguments are satisfactory from the point of view of present-day science. It is self-evident that the French materialists did not know a great deal of what is now known to every schoolboy. It is sufficient to recall the views of Holbach on chemistry and physics, even though he was well acquainted with the natural science of his age. But the French materialists rendered this incontestable and indispensable service, that they thought consistently from the standpoint of the science of their age, and that is all that one can and must demand of thinkers. It is not surprising that the science of our age has advanced beyond the French materialists of last century. What is important is that the adversaries of those philosophers were backward people even in relation to science of that day. True, the historians of philosophy usually oppose to the views of the French materialists the view of Kant, whom, of course, it would be strange to reproach with lack of knowledge. But this contraposition is quite unjustified, and it would not be difficult to show that both Kant and the French materialists took, essentially, the same view, but made use of it differently and therefore arrived at different conclusions, in keeping with the different characteristics of the social relations under the influence of which they lived and thought. We know that this opinion will be found paradoxical by people who are accustomed to believe every word of the historians of philosophy. There is no opportunity to prove it here by circumstantial argument, but we do not refuse to do so, if our opponent should require it. Be that as it may, everyone knows that the French materialists regarded all the spiritual activity of man as a variation of his sensations transformes. To consider spiritual activity from this point of view means to consider all notions, all conceptions and feelings of man to be the result of the influence of his environment upon him. The French materialists did adopt this very view. They constantly, very warmly and quite categorically declared that man, with his views and feelings, is what his environment, that is in the first place nature, and secondly society, make of him. Law without education, man depends entirely on education, affirms Helvetius, understanding by the word education the whole sum total of social influence. This view of man as the fruit of his environment was the principal theoretical basis for the reforming demands of the French materialists. For in reality, if man depends on his environment, if he is obliged to it for all the qualities of his character, then he is obliged to it also for his defects. And consequently if you wish to combat his defects, you must in suitable fashion change his environment, and moreover his social environment in particular, because nature makes man neither bad nor good. Put people in reasonable social relations, that is in such conditions that the instinct of self-preservation of each of them ceases to impel him to struggle against the remainder, coordinate the interests of the individual man with the interests of all society, and virtue will appear of her own accord. Just as a stone falls to the earth of its own accord when it loses any support. Virtue requires, not to be preached, but to be prepared by the reasonable arrangement of social relations. By the light-hearted verdict of the conservatives and reactionaries of last century, the morality of the French materialists is up to the present day considered to be an egotistical morality. They themselves gave a much truer definition to it, that in their view it passed entirely into politics. The doctrine that the spiritual world of man represents the fruit of his environment not infrequently led the French materialists to conclusions which they did not expect themselves. Thus, for example, they sometimes said that the views of man have absolutely no influence on his conduct, and that therefore the spreading of one idea or another in society cannot by a hair's breadth change its subsequent fate. Later on W shall show wherein such an opinion was mistaken, but at this stage let us turn our attention to another side of the views of the French materialists. If the ideas of any particular man are determined by his environment, then the ideas of humanity, in the historical development, are determined by the development of the social environment, by the history of social relationships. Consequently, if we were to think of painting a picture of the progress of human reason, and if we were not to limit ourselves in doing so to the question of, how? In what particular way did the historical advance of reason take place? And put to ourselves the quite natural question of, why? Why did that advance take place just in this fashion, and not otherwise? We should have to begin with the history of the environment, the history of the development of social relations. The center of gravity of our research would thus be shifted, at all events in the first stages, in the direction of studying the laws of social development. The French materialists came right up against this problem, but proved unable not only to solve it but even correctly to state it. Whenever they began speaking of the historical development of mankind, they forgot their sensationalist view of man in general and, like all the philosophers of enlightenment of that age, affirmed that the world, that is the social relations of mankind, is governed by opinions, c'est l'opinion qui gouverne. Le Monde, point 1. In this lies the radical contradiction from which the materialism of the 18th century suffered, and which, in the reasoning of its supporters, was divided into an entire series of secondary and derivative contradictions, just as a banknote is exchanged for small cash. Thesis. Man, with all his opinions, is the product of his environment, and mainly of his social environment. This was the inevitable conclusion from the fundamental position of Locke, no innate principles. Antithesis. Environment, with all its qualities, is the product of opinions. This is the inevitable conclusion from the fundamental position of the historical philosophy of the French materialists, qu'est opinion qui gouverne le monde. From this radical contradiction there followed, for example, the following derivative contradictions. Thesis. Man considers good those social relations which are useful to him. He considers bad those relations which are harmful to him. The opinions of people are determined by their interests. L'opinion chez un people est toujours déterminée par un intérêt dominant, says Sward. This is not even a conclusion from the teachings of Locke, it is simply the repetition of his words, no innate practical principles. Virtue generally approved not because innate, but because profitable. Good and evil are nothing but pleasure or pain, or that which occasions or procures pleasure or pain, to us. Antithesis. The existing relations seem useful or harmful to people, according to the general system of opinions of the people concerned. In the words of the same Sward, every people nie veut, un aime, un affrauve, que ce qu'il croit utile, every people desires, loves and approves only what it considers useful. Consequently I mean by opinion the result of the mass of truths, and in the last resort everything again is reduced to the opinions which govern the world. Thesis. Those are very much mistaken who think that religious morality, for example, the commandment to love one's neighbor, even partially promoted the moral improvement of mankind. Such commandments, as ideas generally, are quite devoid of power over men. Everything depends on social environment and on social relations. 1. Antithesis. Historical experience shows us que les opinions secrètes furent la source véritable des maux du genre humain, and this is quite understandable, because if opinions generally govern the world, then mistaken opinions govern it like bloodthirsty tyrants. It would be easy to lengthen the list of similar contradictions of the French materialists, inherited from them by many materialists in the general philosophical sense of our own age. But this would be unnecessary. Let us rather look more closely at the general character of these contradictions. There are contradictions and contradictions. When Mr. VV2 contradicts himself at every step in his Destinies of Capitalism or in the first volume of his Conclusions from an Economic Investigation of Russia, his sins against logic can be of importance only, possibly, as a human document. The future historian of Russian literature, after pointing out these contradictions, will have to busy himself with the extremely interesting question, in the sense of social psychology, of why, with all their indubitable and obvious character, they remained unnoticed for many and many a reader of Mr. VV. In the direct sense, the contradictions of the writer mentioned are one. This principle is more than once repeated in as barren as the well-known fig tree. There are contradictions of another character. Just as indubitable as the contradictions of Mr. VV, they are distinguished from the latter by the fact that they do not send human thought to sleep, they do not retard its development, but push it on further, and sometimes push it so strongly that, in their consequences, they prove more fruitful than the most symmetrical theories. Of such contradictions one may say in the words of Hegel, "Der Widerspruch ist das fortliche End," contradiction leads the way forward. It is just among these that must be rightfully numbered the contradictions of French materialism in the 18th century. Let us examine their main contradiction. The opinions of men are determined by their environment. The environment is determined by opinions. Of this one has to say what Kant said of his antinomies, that the thesis is just as correct as the antithesis. For in fact there can be no doubt that the opinions of men are determined by the social environment lding them. It is just as much beyond doubt that not a single people will put up with a social order which contradicts all its views. It will revolt against such an order, and reconstruct it according to its own ideals. Consequently it is also true that opinions govern the world. But then in what way can two propositions, true in themselves, contradict each other? The explanation is very simple. They contradict each other only because we are looking at them from an incorrect point of view. From that point of view it seems and inevitably must seem that if the thesis is right, then the antithesis is mistaken, and vice versa. But once you discover a correct point of view, the contradiction will disappear, and each of the propositions which confuse you will assume a new aspect. It will turn out to be supplementing or, more exactly, conditioning the other proposition, not excluding it at all. And that if this proposition were untrue, then equally untrue would be the other proposition, which previously seemed to you to be its antagonist. But how is such a correct point of view to be discovered? Let us take an example. It often used to be said, particularly in the 18th century, that the constitution of any given people was conditioned by the manners of that people. And this was quite justified. When the old republican manners of the Romans disappeared, their republic gave way to a monarchy. But on the other hand it used no less frequently to be asserted that the manners of a given people are conditioned by its constitution. This also cannot be doubted in the least. For in reality, how could republican manners appear in the Romans of the time, for example, of Heliogabalus? Is it not patently clear that the manners of the Romans during the empire were bound to represent something quite opposite to the old republican manners? And if it is clear, then we come to the general conclusion that the constitution is conditioned by manners, and manners by the constitution. But then this is a contradictory conclusion. Probably we arrived at it on account of the mistaken character of one or the other of our propositions. Which in particular? Rack your brains as you will not discover anything wrong either in one or in the other. They are both irreproachable, as in reality the manners of every given people do influence its constitution, and in this sense are its cause, while on the other hand they are conditioned by the constitution, and in this sense are its consequence. Where, then, is the way out? Usually, in questions of this kind, people confine themselves to discovering interaction. Manners influence the constitution, constitution influences manners. Everything becomes as clear as daylight, and people who are not satisfied with clarity of this kind betray a tendency to one-sidedness worthy of every condemnation. That is how almost all our intellectuals argue at the present time. They look at social life from the point of view of interaction. Each side of life influences all others and, in its turn, experiences the influence of all the others. Only such a view is worthy of a thinking sociologist, while those who, like the Marxists, keep on seeking for some more profound reasons or other for social development, simply don't see to what degree social life is complicated. The French writers of the Enlightenment were also inclined to this point of view, when they felt the necessity of bringing their views on social life into logical order and of solving the contradictions which were getting the upper hand of them. The most systematic minds among them, we do not refer here to Rousseau, who in general had little in common with the writers of the Enlightenment, did not go any further. Thus, for example, it is this viewpoint of interaction that is maintained by Montesquieu in his famous works, Grandeur et Décadence des Romains and l'Esprit des Lois. 1 And this, of course, is a justifiable point of view. Interaction undoubtedly exists between all sides of social life. Unfortunately this justifiable point of view explains very little, for the simple reason that it gives no indication as to the origin of the interacting forces. If the constitution itself presupposes the manners which it influences, then obviously it is not to the constitution that those manners owe their first appearance. The same must be said of the manners too. If they already presuppose the constitution which they influence, then it is clear that it is not they which created it. In order to get rid of this muddle we must discover the historical factor which produced both the manners of the given people and its constitution, and thereby created the very possibility of their interaction. If we discover such a factor we shall reveal the correct point of view we are seeking, and then we shall solve without difficulty the contradiction which confuses us. In its application to the fundamental contradiction of the French materialists, this means the following. The French materialists were very mistaken when, contradicting their customary view of history, they said that ideas mean nothing, since environment means everything. No less mistaken was that customary view of theirs on history, c'est l'opinion qui gouverne le monde, which proclaimed opinions to be the main fundamental reason for the existence of any given social environment. One Holbach in his Politique naturelle takes the standpoint of interaction between manners and constitution. But as he has there to deal with practical questions, this point of view leads him into a vicious circle. In order to improve manners one must perfect the constitution, and in order to improve the constitution, one must improve manners. Holbach is rescued from this circle by an imaginary band prince, who was desired by all the writers of the Enlightenment, and who, appearing like Deus ex machina, solved the contradiction. Improving both manners and constitution together, between opinions and environment there exists undoubted interaction. But scientific investigation cannot stop at recognizing this interaction, since interaction is far from explaining social phenomena to us. In order to understand the history of mankind, that is in the present case the history of its opinions, on the one hand, and the history of those social relations through which it passed in its development, on the other, we must rise above the point of view of interaction, and discover if possible that factor which determines both the development of the social environment and the development of opinions. The problem of social science in the 19th century was precisely to discover that factor. The world is governed by opinions. But then, opinions do not remain unchanged. What conditions their changes? The spreading of enlightenment, replied, as early as the 17th century, la mouth l'ouvert. This is the most abstract and most superficial expression of the idea that opinions dominate the world. The writers of the Enlightenment of the 18th century held to it firmly, sometimes supplementing it with melancholy reflections that the fate of enlightenment, unfortunately, is in general very unreliable. But among the most talented of them there was already noticeable the realization that such a view was unsatisfactory. Helvetius remarked that the development of knowledge is subordinated to certain laws, and that consequently there exist some hidden and unknown causes on which it depends. He made an attempt of the highest interest, still not assessed at its true value, to explain the social and intellectual development of man by his material needs. This attempt ended, and for many reasons could not but end, in failure. But it remained a testament, as it were, for those thinkers of the following century who might wish to continue the work of the French materialists. Chapter 2, French Historians of the Restoration. One of the most important conclusions which can be drawn from the study of history is that government is the most effective cause of the character of peoples. That the virtues or the vices of nations, their energy or the weakness, their talents, their enlightenment or their ignorance, are hardly ever the consequence of climate or of the qualities of the particular race, but are the work of the laws. That nature has given all to everyone, while government preserves or destroys, in the men subjected to it, those qualities which originally constituted the common heritage of the human race. In Italy there occurred no changes either in climate or in race. The influx of the barbarians was too insignificant to alter the latter's quality. Nature was the same for Italians of all ages. Only government changed, and these changes always preceded or accompanied changes in the national character. In this way Sismondi contested the doctrine which made the historical fate of peoples depend only on geographical environment. His objections are not unfounded. In fact, geography is far from explaining everything in history, just because the latter is history, that is because, in Sismondi's words, governments change in spite of the fact that geographical environment remains unchanged. But this in passing, we are interested here in quite a different question. The reader has probably already noticed that, comparing the unchanging character of geographical environment with the changeability of the historical destinies of peoples, Sismondi links these destinies with one main factor: government, that is with the political institutions of the given country. The character of a people is entirely determined by the character of the one Histoire des Républiques Italiennes au MQYENH, Paris, T. Government. True, having stated this proposition categorically, Sismondi immediately and very essentially modifies it. Political changes, he says, preceded changes of the national character or accompanied them. Here it appears that the character of the government is rather determined upon occasion by the character of the people. But in this case the historical philosophy of Sismondi encounters the contradiction with which we are already familiar, and which confused the French writers of the Enlightenment. The manners of a given people depend on its constitution. Their constitution depends on their manners. Sismondi was just as little able to solve this contradiction as the writers of the Enlightenment. He was forced in turn to found his arguments now upon one, now upon the other branch of this antinomy. But be that as it may, having once decided on one of them, namely that which proclaimed that the character of a people depends on its government, he attributed to the conception of government an exaggeratedly wide meaning. In his eyes it embraced absolutely all the qualities of the given social environment, all the peculiarities of the particular social relations concerned. It would be more exact to say that in his view absolutely all the qualities of the social environment concerned were the work of government, the result of the constitution. This is the point of view of the 18th century. When the French materialists wanted briefly and strongly to express their conviction of the omnipotent influence of environment on man, they used to say, c'est la législation qui fait tout, everything depends on legislation. But when they spoke of legislation, they had in mind almost exclusively political legislation, the system of government. Among the works of the famous J. B. Vico there is a little article entitled, Essay of a System of Jurisprudence, in which the civil law of the Romans is explained by their political revolutions. Although this essay was written at the one we translate the very beginning of the 18th The 18th century, nevertheless, the view it expresses on the relationship between civil law and the system of government prevailed up to the French Restoration. The writers of the Enlightenment reduced everything to politics. But the political activity of the legislator is in any event a conscious activity, although naturally not always expedient. The conscious activity of man depends on his opinions. In this way the French writers of the Enlightenment without noticing it themselves return to the idea of the omnipotence of opinions, even in those cases when they desired vividly to express the idea of the omnipotence of environment. Sismondi was still adopting the viewpoint of the 18th century. Younger French historians were already holding other views. The course and outcome of the French Revolution, with its surprises that nonplussed the most enlightened thinkers, proved a refutation, graphic to the highest degree, of the idea that opinions were omnipotent. Then many became quite disillusioned in the power of reason, while others who did not give way to disillusionment began all the more to incline to acceptance of the idea of the omnipotence of environment, and to studying the course of its development. But environment too began to be examined, in the era of the Restoration, from a new point of view. Great historic events had made such a mock, both of legislators, and of political constitutions, that now it already seemed strange to make dependent on the latter, as a basic factor, all the qualities of a particular social environment. Now political constitutions began to be considered as something derivative, as a consequence and not as a cause. Milan edition in 6 volumes of 1835. The majority of writers, scholars, historians or publicists, says Guizot in his essay sur l'histoire de France, have attempted to explain the condition of society, the degree or the nature of its civilization, by the study of its political institutions. It would be wiser to begin with the study of society itself, in order to learn and understand its political institutions. Before becoming a cause, institutions are a consequence. Society creates them before it begins to change under their influence. And instead of judging of the condition of a people from the system or the forms of its government, we must first of all investigate the condition of the people, in order to judge what should be and what could be its government. Society, its composition, the mode of life of individual persons in keeping with their social position, the relations of various classes of persons, in a word, the civil condition of men, l'état des persons, such, without doubt, is the first question which attracts the attention of the historian who desires to know how peoples lived, and of the publicist who desires to know how they were governed. This view is directly opposed to the view of Vico. The latter explained the history of civil law by political revolutions. Guizot explains the political order by civil conditions, that is by civil law. But the French historian goes even further in his analysis of social composition. He states that, among all the peoples who appeared on the historical arena after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the civil condition of men was closely connected with agrarian relations, état des terres, and therefore the study of their agrarian relations must precede the study of their civil condition. In order to understand political institutions, we must study the various strata existing in society and their mutual relationships. In order to understand these various social strata, we must know the nature and the relations of landed property. It is from this point of view that Guizot accordingly studies the history of France under their first edition appeared in 1821. 2 essays, Taine edition, Paris, 1860 pages 73-4. 3 Ibid, pages 75-6. The first 2 dynasties. In his presentation it appears as the history of the struggle of various strata of society at the time. In his history of the English Revolution he makes a new step forward, representing this event as the struggle of the bourgeoisie against the aristocracy, and tacitly recognizing in this way that to explain the political life of a particular country it is necessary to study not only its agrarian relations, but also all its property relations in general. One such a view of the political history of Europe was far from being the exclusive property of Guizot at that time. It was shared by many other historians, among whom we shall refer to Augustin Thierry and Mignot. In his views des Revolutions d'Angleterre represents the history of the English revolutions as the struggle of the bourgeoisie against the aristocracy. Everyone whose ancestors were numbered among the conquerors of England, he writes of the first revolution, left his castle and journeyed to the royal camp, where he took up a position appropriate to his rank. The inhabitants of the towns and ports in crowds passed into the opposite camp. Then it might have been said that the armies were gathering, one in the name of idleness and authority, the other in the name of labor and liberty. All idlers, whatever their origin, all those who sought in life only enjoyment, secured without labor, rallied under the royal banner, defending interests similar to their own interests. And on the contrary, those of the descendants won the struggle of religious and political parties of the former conquerors of eclectics, even in those good old times when their brains worked much more than they work nowadays. The eclectics reproached the partisans of the new historical theories with fatalism, of eclectics, even in those good old times when their brains worked much more than they work nowadays. Of eclectics, of the former conquerors who were then engaged in industry joined the party of the common. The religious movement of the time was, in Thierry's opinion, only the reflection of positive lay interests. On both sides the war was waged for positive interests. All else was external or a pretext. The men who defended the cause of the subjects were for the most part Presbyterians, that is they desired no subjection even in religion. Those who adhered to the opposite party belonged to the Anglican or the Catholic faith. This was because, even in the religious sphere, they strove for authority and for the imposition of taxes on men. Thierry quotes in this connection the following words of Fox in his History of the Reign of James II. The Whigs considered all religious opinions with a view to politics, even in the hatred to popery. They did not so much regard a superstition, or imputed idolatry of that unpopular sect, as its tendency to establish arbitrary power in the state. In Mignot's opinion, the movement of society is determined by the dominating interests. Amid various obstacles, this movement strives towards its end, halts once that end has been reached, and yields place to another movement which at first is imperceptible, and becomes apparent only when it becomes predominant. Such was the course of development of feudalism. Feudalism existed in the needs of man while it still did not exist in fact the first epoch. In the second epoch it existed in fact, gradually ceasing to correspond to men's needs, wherefore there came to an end, ultimately, its existence in fact. Not a single revolution has yet taken place in any other way. 2. In his History of the French Revolution, Mignot regards events precisely from this point of view of the needs of various social classes. The struggle of these classes constitutes in his work the mainspring of political events. Naturally, such a view could not be to the taste one dixans Altitudes historiques of eclectics, even in those good old times when their brains worked much more than they work nowadays. The eclectics reproached the partisans of the new historical theories with fatalism, with prejudice in favor of a system, esprit de system. As always happens in such cases, the eclectics did not notice at all the really weak sides of the new theories, but in return with the greater energy attacked their unquestionably strong sides. However, this is as old as the world itself, and is therefore of little interest. Much more interesting is the circumstance that these new views were defended by the Saint Simonist Bizard, one of the most brilliant representatives of the socialism of that day. Bizard did not consider Mignot's book on the French Revolution to be without reproach. Its defect was, in his eyes, that among other things it represented the event it described as a separate fact, standing without any connection with that long chain of efforts which, having overthrown the old social order, was to facilitate the establishment of the new regime. But the book also has unquestionable merits. The author has set himself the task of characterizing those parties which, one after the other, direct the revolution, of revealing the connection of these parties with various social classes, of displaying what particular chain of events places them one after the other at the head of the movement, and how finally they disappear. That same spirit of system and fatalism, which the eclectics put forward as a reproach against the historians of the new tendency, advantageously distinguishes, in Bizard's opinion, the work of Guizot and Mignot from the works of literary historians, that is historians concerned only for beauty of style, who, in spite of all their numbers, have not moved historical science forward one step since the 18th century. 1. If Augustin Thierry, Guizot or Mignot had been asked, do the manners of a people create its constitution, or on the contrary does its constitution create its manners, each of them would have replied that, however great and however unquestionable is the interaction of the manners one considerations sur l'histoire, in the Producteur, Part 4, of a people and its constitution, yet in the last analysis both one and the other owe their existence to a third factor, lying more deep, the civil condition of men, their property relations. In this way the contradiction in which the philosophers of the 18th century were wandering would have been solved, and every impartial person would recognize that Bizard was right in saying that science had made a step forward, in the person of the representatives of the new views on history. But we know already that the contradiction mentioned is only a particular case of the fundamental contradiction of the views on society held in the 18th century, i.e., man with all his thoughts and feelings is the product of environment. Environment is the creation of man, the product of his opinions. Can it be said that the new views on history had resolved this fundamental contradiction of French materialism? Let us examine how the French historians of the Restoration explained the origin of that civil condition, those property relations, the close study of which alone could, in their opinion, provide the key to the understanding of historical events. The origin of property relations. The property relations of men belong to the sphere of their legal relations. Property is first of all a legal institution. To say that the key to understanding historical phenomena must be sought in the property relations of men means saying that this key lies in institutions of law. But whence do these institutions come? Guizot says quite rightly that political constitutions were a consequence before they became a cause. That society first created them and then began to change under their influence. But cannot the same be said of property relations? Were not they in their turn a consequence before they became a cause? Did not society have first to create them before it could experience their decisive influence on itself? To these quite reasonable questions Guizot gives highly unsatisfactory replies. Among the peoples who appeared on the historical arena after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, civil conditions stood in the closest causal connection with land ownership. One, the relation of man to the land determined his social position. Throughout the epoch of feudalism, all institutions of society were determined in the last analysis by agrarian relations. As for those relations, they, in the words of the same Guizot, at first, during the first period after the invasion of the barbarians, were determined by the social position of the landowners. The land acquired this or that character, according to the degree of strength of the landowner. Point 2. But what then determined, in that case, the social position of the landowners? What determined at first, during the first period after the invasion of the barbarians, the greater or lesser degree of liberty, the greater or lesser degree of power of the landowner? Was it previous political relations among the barbarian conquerors? But Guizot has already told us that political relations are a consequence and not a cause. In order to understand the political life of the barbarians in the epoch preceding the fall of the Roman Empire, we should have, according to the advice of our author, to study their civil condition, their social order, the relations of various classes in their midst, and so forth. And such a study would once again bring us to the question of what determines the property relations of men, what creates the forms of property existing in a given society. And it is obvious that we should gain nothing if, in order to explain the position of various classes in society, we began referring to the relative degrees of their freedom and power. This would be, not a reply, but a repetition of the question in a new form, with some details. The question of the origin of property relations is hardly likely even to have arisen in Guizot's mind in the shape of a scientific problem, strictly and accurately one consequently, only among modern peoples. This restriction is all the more strange that already Greek and Roman writers had seen the close connection between the civil and political life of their countries, and agrarian relations. However, this strange limitation did not prevent Guizot making the fall of the Roman Empire depend upon its state economy. See his first essay Du régime municipal dans l'Empire romain au siècle de l'ère chrétienne. 2. That is, land ownership bore this or that legal character, or in other words its possession involved a greater or lesser degree of dependence, according to the strength and liberty of the landowner. Formulated. We have seen that it was quite impossible for him not to have taken account of the question, but the very confusion of the replies which he gave to it bears witness to the unclarity with which he conceived it. In the last analysis, the development of forms of property was explained by Guizot by exceptionally vague references to human nature. It is not surprising that this historian, whom the eclectics accused of excessively systematic views, himself turned out to be no mean eclectic, for example in his works on the history of civilization. Augustin Thierry, who examined the struggle of religious sects and political parties from the viewpoint of the positive interests of various social classes and passionately sympathized with the struggle of the Third Estate against the aristocracy, explained the origin of these classes and ranks in conquest. Tad sila date dun conquet. Il y a une conquête et desses, all this dates from a conquest. There's a conquest at the bottom of it, he says, of class and rank relations among the modern peoples, which are exclusively the subject of his writing. He incessantly developed this idea in various ways, both in his articles and in his later learned works. But apart from the fact that conquest an international political act returned Thierry to the point of view of the 18th century, which explained all social life by the activity of the legislator, that is of political authority, every fact of conquest inevitably arouses the question, why were its social consequences these, and not those? Before the invasion of the German barbarians, Gaul had already lived through a Roman conquest. The social consequences of that conquest were very different from those which were produced by the German conquest. The social consequences of the conquest of China by the Mongols very little resembled the social consequences of the conquest of England by the Normans. Whence do such differences come? To say that they are determined by differences in the social structure of the various peoples which come into conflict at different times means to say nothing, because what determines that social structure remains unknown. To refer in this question to some previous conquests means moving in a vicious circle. However many the conquest you enumerate, you will nevertheless arrive in the long run at the inevitable conclusion that in the social life of peoples, there is some unknown factor, which is not only not determined by conquests, but which on the contrary itself conditions the consequences of conquests, and even frequently, perhaps always, the conquests themselves, and is the fundamental reason for international conflicts. Thierry in his history of the conquest of England by the Normans himself points out, on the basis of old monuments, the motives which guided the Anglo-Saxons in their desperate struggle for their independence. We must fight, said one of the earls, whatever may be the danger to us. For what we have to consider is not whether we shall accept and receive a new lord. The case is quite otherwise. The Duke of Normandy has given our lands to his barons, to his knights and to all his men, the greater part of whom have already done homage to him for them. They will all look for their gift, if their duke become our king. And he himself will be bound to deliver up to them our lands, our wives and our daughters. All this is promised to them beforehand. They come, not only to ruin us, but to ruin our descendants also, and to take from us the country of our ancestors, etc. On his part, William the Conqueror said to his companions, fight well and put all to death. For if we conquer we shall all be rich. What I gain, you will gain. If I conquer, you will conquer. If I take this land, you shall have it. 1. Here it is abundantly clear that the conquest was not an end in itself, and that beneath it lay certain positive, that is economic interests. The question is, what gave those interests the form which they then had? Why was it that both natives and conquerors were inclined precisely to the feudal system of land ownership, and not to any other? Conquest explains nothing in this case. In Thierry's history of the Third Estate, and in all his sketches of the internal history of France and one history of the conquest of England by the Normans, English Eden. London, 1841, pp 67, 68. England, we have already a fairly full picture of the historical advance of the bourgeoisie. It is sufficient to study even this picture to see how unsatisfactory is the view which makes dependent on conquest the origin and development of a given social system. That development progressed quite at variance with the interests and wishes of the feudal aristocracy, that is the conquerors and their descendants. It can be said without any exaggeration that Thierry himself took care that his historical researches should refute his own views on the historical role of conquests. 1. In Mignot we find the same confusion. He speaks of the influence of land ownership on political forms. But what the forms of land ownership depend on, while they develop in this or that direction, this Mignot does not know. In the last analysis he too makes forms of land ownership depend on conquest. 2. He feels that in the history of international conflicts also we're dealing, not with abstract conceptions such as conquerors and conquered, but with people possessing living flesh, having definite rights and social relations. But here too, his analysis does not go very far. When two peoples living on the same soil mingle one with the other, he says, they lose the weak sides and communicate their strong sides to each other. 3. This is not profound, nor is it quite clear. Placed face to face with the question of the origin of property relations, each of the French historians of the time of the Restoration whom we have mentioned would probably have attempted, like Guizot, to escape from the difficulty with the help of more or less ingenious references to human nature. The view of human nature as the highest authority one. It is interesting that the Saint-Simonists already saw this weak side of the historical views of Thierry. Thus, Bizard, in the article quoted earlier, remarks that conquest in reality exercised much less influence on the development of European society than Thierry thought. Everyone understanding the laws of development of humanity sees that the role of conquest is quite subordinate. But in this case Thierry is closer to the views of his former teacher Saint Simon than is Bizard. Saint Simon examines the history of Western Europe from the 15th century from the viewpoint of the development of economic relations, but explains the social order of the Middle Ages merely as the product of conquest. 2. De la Fidelity, pages 50. 3. Ibid, pages 212. D. Which decides all knotty cases in the sphere of law, morality, politics and economics, was inherited in its entirety by the writers of the 19th century from the writers of the Enlightenment of the previous century. If man, when he appears in the world, does not bring with him a prepared store of innate practical ideas. If virtue is respected, not because it is innate in people, but because it is useful, as Locke asserted. If the principle of social utility is the highest law, as Helvetius said. If man is the measure of things wherever there is a question of mutual human relations, then it is quite natural to draw the conclusion that the nature of man is the viewpoint from which we should judge of the utility or harmfulness, the wisdom or senselessness, of particular relations. It was from this standpoint that the writers of the Enlightenment of the 18th century discussed both the social order then existing and the reforms which they found desirable. Human nature was for them the most important argument in their discussions with their opponents. How great in their eyes was the importance of this argument is shown excellently, for example, by the following observation of Condorcet: the ideas of justice and law take shape invariably in an identical form among all beings gifted with the capacity of sensation and of acquiring ideas. Therefore they will be identical. True, it happens that people distort them, lay alternate. But every man who thinks correctly will just as inevitably arrive at certain ideas in morality as in mathematics. These ideas represent the necessary conclusion from the irrefutable truth that men are perceptive and rational beings. In reality the views on society of the French writers of the Enlightenment were not deduced, of course, from this more than meagre truth, but were suggested to them by their environment. The man whom they had in view was distinguished not only by his capacity to perceive and think, his nature demanded a definite bourgeois system of society. The works of Holbach included just those demands which later were put into effect by the Constituent Assembly. His nature prescribed free trade, non-interference of the state in the property relations of citizens, laissez-faire, laissez-passer, one etc., etc. The writers of the Enlightenment looked on human nature through the prism of particular social needs and relations. But they did not suspect that history had put some prism before their eyes. They imagined that through their lips there was speaking human nature itself, understood and assessed at its true value, at last, by the enlightened representatives of humanity. Not all the writers of the 18th century had an identical conception of human nature. Sometimes they differed very strongly among themselves on this subject. But all of them were equally convinced that a correct view of that nature alone could provide the key to the explanation of social phenomena. We said earlier that many French writers of the Enlightenment had already noticed a certain conformity to law in the development of human reason. They were led to the idea of this conformity to law first and foremost by the history of literature. What people, they asked, was not first a poet and only then a thinker? 2. But how is such a conformity to be explained? By the needs of society, which determined even the development of language, replied the philosophers. The art of speech, like all other arts, is the fruit of social needs and interests, asserted the Abbé Arnaud, in the address just mentioned in a footnote. Social needs change, and therefore their change is also the course of development of the arts. But what determines social needs? Social needs, the needs of men who compose society, are determined by the nature of man. Consequently it is in that nature that we must seek the explanation of this, and not that, course of intellectual development. In order to play the part of the highest criterion, one true, not always. Sometimes, in the name of the same nature, the philosophers advised the legislator to smooth out the inequalities of property. This was one of the numerous contradictions of the French writers of the Enlightenment. But here we are not concerned with this. For us is important only the fact that the abstract nature of man in every given case was an argument in favor of the quite concrete aspirations of one stratum of society or another, and moreover only of bourgeois society. 2. Grimm. Human nature obviously had to be considered as fixed once for all, as invariable. The writers of the Enlightenment did in fact regard it as such, as the reader could see from the words of Condorcet quoted above. But if human nature is invariable, how then can it serve to explain the course of the intellectual or social development of mankind? What is the process of any development? A series of changes. Can those changes be explained with the help of something that is invariable, that is fixed once for all? Is this the reason why a variable magnitude changes, that a constant magnitude remains unchanged? The writers of the Enlightenment realized that this could not be so, and in order to get out of their difficulty they pointed out that the constant magnitude itself proves to be variable, within certain limits. Man goes through different ages, childhood, youth, maturity and so forth. At these various ages his needs are not identical. In his childhood man has only his feelings, his imagination and memory, he seeks only to be amused and requires only songs and stories. The age of passions succeeds, the soul requires to be moved and agitated. Then the intelligence extends and reason grows stronger, both these faculties in their turn require exercise, and their activity extends to everything that is capable of arousing curiosity. Thus develops the individual man. These changes are conditioned by his nature. And just because they are in his nature, they are to be noticed in the spiritual development of all mankind. It is by these changes that is to be explained the circumstance that peoples begin with epics and end with philosophy. It is easy to see that explanations of this kind, which did not explain anything at all, only imbued the description of the course of intellectual development of man with a certain picturesqueness, simile always sets off more vividly the quality of the object being described. It is easy to see likewise that, in giving explanations of this kind, the thinkers of the 18th century were moving round the already familiar charm circle: environment creates man, man creates environment. For one Sward, Locke's It, pages 383. In effect, on the one hand it appeared that the intellectual development of mankind, that is in other words the development of human nature, was explained by social needs, and on the other it turned out that the development of social needs is to be explained by the development of human nature. Thus we see that the French historians of the Restoration also did not eliminate this contradiction, it only took a new form with them. Chapter 3, The Utopian Socialists. If human nature is invariable, and if, knowing its main qualities, we can deduce from them mathematically accurate principles in the sphere of morality and social science, it will not be difficult to invent a social order which fully corresponds to the requirements of human nature, and just for that very reason will be an ideal social order. The materialists of the 18th century were already very willing to engage in research on the subject of a perfect system of laws. These researches represent the utopian element in the literature of the Enlightenment. The utopian socialists of the first half of the 19th century devoted themselves to such researches with all their heart. The utopian socialists of this age entirely accepted the anthropological views of the French materialists. Just like the materialists, they considered man to be the product of the social environment around him, too, and just like the materialists they fell into a vicious circle, explaining the variable qualities of the environment of man by the unchanging qualities of human nature. All the numerous utopias of the first half of the present century represent nothing else than attempts to invent a perfect legislation, taking human nature as the supreme one. Helvetius, in his book, Criterion. Thus, Fourier takes as his point of departure the analysis of human passions. Thus, Robert Owen in his outline of the rational system of society starts from the first principles of human nature, and asserts that rational government must first of all ascertain what human nature is. Thus, the Saint-Simonists declare that their philosophy is founded on a new conception of human nature. Thus, the Fourierists say that the social organization invented by their teacher represents a number of irrefutable deductions from the immutable laws of human nature. Naturally, the view of human nature as the supreme criterion did not prevent the various socialist schools from differing among themselves very energetically in defining the qualities of that nature. Thus, in the opinion of the Saint-Simonists, the plans of Owen contradict to such an extent the inclinations of human nature that the sort of popularity which they, apparently, enjoy at the present time seems at first glance to be inexplicable. 3 In Fourier's polemical pamphlet, Piaget et Charlatanisme des deux sectes Saint-Simon et Owen, qui promettent l'association et le progrès, we can find a number of harsh indications that the Saint-Simonist teaching also contradicts all the inclinations of human nature. Now, as at the time of Condorcet, it appeared that to agree in the definition of human nature was much more difficult than to define a geometrical figure. To the extent that the utopian socialists of the 19th century held to the point of view of human nature, to that extent they only repeated the mistakes of the thinkers of the 18th century, an error which was common, however, to all social science contemporary. C'est le producteur with them. But we can see in them an energetic effort to break out of the narrow confines of an abstract conception, and to take their stand upon solid ground. More remarkable than others in this respect are the works of Saint Simon. While the writers of the French Enlightenment most frequently have all regarded the history of humanity as a series of more or less happy but chance occurrences, too Saint Simon seeks in history first conformity to law. The science of human society must become just as exact as natural science. We must study the facts of the past life of mankind in order to discover in them the laws of its progress. Only he is capable of foreseeing the future who has understood the past. Expressing the task of social science in this way, Saint Simon turned in particular to the study of the history of Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. The novelty and breadth of his views can be seen from the fact that his pupil Thierry could effect almost an entire revolution in the working out of French history. Saint Simon was of the opinion that Guizot also borrowed his views from himself. Leaving undecided this question of theoretical property, we shall note that Saint Simon was able to we have already demonstrated this in trace the mainsprings of the internal development of European societies further than the specialist historians who were his contemporaries. Thus, if both Thiers and Mignot, and likewise Guizot, pointed to property relations as the foundation of any social order, Saint Simon, who most vividly and for the first time threw light on the history of these relations in modern Europe, went further and asked himself, why is it that precisely these, and no other relations, play such an important part? The answer is to be sought, in his opinion, in the requirements of industrial development. Up to the 15th century lay authority was in the hands of the nobility, and this was useful because the nobles were then the most capable industrialists. They directed agricultural works, and agricultural works were then the only kind of important industrial occupation. Point 1 to the question of why the needs of industry have such a decisive importance in the history of mankind, Saint Simon replied that it was because the object of social organization is production. He attributed such a significance to production that he identified the useful with the productive, l'utilité la production. He categorically declared that politics is the science of production. It would seem that the logical development of such views should have brought Saint Simon to the conclusion that the laws of production are those very laws by which in the last analysis social development is determined, and the study of which must represent the task of the thinker striving to foresee the future. At times he, as it were, approaches this idea, but only at times, and he only approaches it. For production the implements of labor are necessary. These implements are not provided by nature ready-made, they are invented by man. The inventing and even the simple use of a particular implement presupposes in the producer a certain degree of intellectual development. The development of industry therefore represents the unquestionable result of the intellectual development of mankind. It seems as though one opinions littéraires, philosophiques et industriels, Enlightenment, Lumières, here also reign unchallenged over the world. And the more the important role of industry emerges, the more is confirmed, seemingly, this view of the philosophers of the 18th century. Saint Simon holds it even more consistently than the French writers of the Enlightenment, as he considers the question of the origin of ideas in sensations to be settled, and has less grounds for meditation on the influence of environment on man. The development of knowledge is for him the fundamental factor of historical advance. He tries to discover the laws of that development. Thus he establishes that same law of 3 stages: theological, metaphysical and positive, which later on Auguste Comte very successfully gave out to be his own discovery. Point 2 But these laws too, Saint Simon explains in the long run by the qualities of human nature. Society consists of individuals, he says, therefore the development of social reason can be only the reproduction of the development of the individual reason on a larger scale. Starting from this fundamental principle, he considers his laws of social development finally ascertained and proved whenever he succeeds in discovering, to confirm them, a successful analogy in the development of the individual. He asserts, for example, that the role of authority in social one Saint Simon leads the idealistic view of history to its last and extreme conclusion. For him not only our life will in time be reduced to zero. The gradual but incessant diminution of this role is one of the laws of development of humanity. How then does he prove this law? The main argument in its favor is reference to the individual development of man. In the elementary school the child is obliged unconditionally to obey his elders. In the secondary and higher school, the element of obedience gradually falls into the background, in order finally to yield its place to independent action in maturity. However anyone may regard the history of authority, everyone will nowadays agree that here, as everywhere, comparison is not proof. The embryological development of any particular individual, ontogenesis, presents many analogies with the history of the species to which this individual belongs. Ontogenesis supplies many important indications about phylogenesis. But what should we now say of a biologist who attempted to assert that in ontogenesis must be sought the ultimate explanation of phylogenesis? Modern biology acts in the exactly opposite way. It explains the embryological history of the individual by the history of the species. The appeal to human nature gave a quite peculiar appearance to all the laws of social development formulated both by Saint Simon himself and by his followers. It led them into the vicious circle. The history of mankind is explained by its nature. But whence do we discover the nature of man? From history. Obviously, if we move in this circle, we cannot understand either the nature of man or his history, and we can make only individual, more or less profound observations, here and there, concerning this or that sphere of social phenomena. Saint Simon made some very subtle observations, sometimes truly instinct with genius, but his main object, that of discovering a firm scientific foundation for politics, remained unattained. Law in nature, the supreme law of progress of human reason. This idea was later borrowed from him and distorted by Proudhon, who built on it his theory of anarchy. Says Saint Simon, subordinates all to itself, rules over everything, men for it are only tools. And although this force, that is this law, arises from ourselves, we can just as little set ourselves free from its influence or subordinate it to ourselves as we could at our whim change the working of the force which obliges the earth to revolve around the sun. All we can do is consciously to submit to this law, our true providence, realizing the direction which it prescribes for us, instead of obeying it blindly. Let us remark in passing that it is just in this that will consist the grand step forward which the philosophical intelligence of our age is destined to accomplish. And so humanity is absolutely subordinated to the law of its own intellectual development. It could not escape the influence of that law, even should it so desire. Let us examine this statement more closely, and take as an example the law of the 3 stages. Mankind moved from theological thought to metaphysical, from metaphysical to positive. This law acted with the force of the laws of mechanics. This may very well be so, but the question arises, how are we to understand the idea that mankind, even should it so desire, could not alter the workings of this law? Does this mean that it could not have avoided metaphysics even had it realized the advantages of positive thinking while still at the end of the theological period? Evidently no. And if the answer is no, then it is no less evident that there is some lack of clarity in St. Simon's view of the conformity of intellectual development to law. Wherein lies this unclarity? Whence does it arise? It lies in the very contrasting of the law with the desire to alter its action. Once such a desire has made its appearance among mankind, it becomes itself a fact in the history of mankind's intellectual development, and the law must embrace this fact, not come into conflict with it. So long as we admit the possibility of such a conflict, we have not yet made clear to ourselves the conception of law itself, and we shall infallibly fall into one organisator, p. RLG, vol. 4 of the works of St. Simon, or vol. 20 of the complete works of St. Simon and Infantine. One of two extremes: either we shall abandon the standpoint of conformity to law and will be taking up the viewpoint of what is desirable, or we shall completely let the desirable, or more truly, what was desired by the people of the given epoch, fall out of our field of vision, and thereby we shall be attributing to law some mystical shade of significance, transforming it into a kind of fate. Law in the writing of St. Simon and of the utopians generally, to the extent that they speak of conformity to law, is just such a fate. We may remark in passing that when the Russian subjective sociologists rise up in defense of personality, ideas, and other excellent things, they are warring precisely with the utopian, unclear, incomplete and therefore worthless doctrine of the natural course of things. Our sociologists appear never even to have heard what constitutes the modern scientific conception of the laws underlying the historical development of society. Whence arose the utopian lack of clarity in the conception of conformity to law? It arose from the radical defect, which we have already pointed out, in the view of the development of humanity which the utopians held and, as we know already, not they alone. The history of humanity was explained by the nature of man. Once that nature was fixed, there were also fixed the laws of historical development. All history was given and psyche, as Hegel would have said. Man can just as little interfere in the course of his development as he can cease being man. The law of development makes its appearance in the form of providence. This is historical fatalism, which arises as the result of a doctrine considering the successes of knowledge and consequently the conscious activity of man to be the mainspring of historical progress. But let us go further. If the key to the understanding of history is provided by the study of the nature of man, what is important to me is not so much the study of the facts of history as the correct understanding of human nature. Once I have acquired the right view of the latter, I lose almost all interest in social life as it is, and concentrate all my attention on social life as it ought to be in keeping with the nature of man. Fatalism in history does not in the least interfere with a utopian attitude to reality in practice. On the contrary, it promotes such an attitude, by breaking off the thread of scientific investigation. Fatalism in general marches frequently hand in hand with the most extreme subjectivism. Fatalism very commonly proclaims its own state of mind to be an inevitable law of history. It is just of the fatalists that one can say, in the words of the poet, was sei den Geist der Geschichte nennen. Street nur der Herren eine Geist one. The St. Simonists asserted that the share of the social product which falls to the exploiters of another's labor, gradually diminishes. Such a diminution was in their eyes the most important law governing the economic development of humanity. As a proof they referred to the gradual decline in the level of interest and land rent. If in this case they had kept to the methods of strict scientific investigation, they would have discovered the economic causes of the phenomenon to which they pointed, and for this they would have had attentively to study production, reproduction and distribution of products. Had they done this they would have seen, perhaps, that the decline in the level of interest or even of land rent, if it really takes place, does not by any means prove of itself that there is a decline in the share of the property owners. Then their economic law would, of course, have found quite a different formulation. But they were not interested in this. Confidence in the omnipotence of the mysterious laws arising out of the nature of man directed their intellectual activity into quite a different sphere. A tendency which has predominated in history up to now can only grow stronger in the future, said they. The constant diminution in the share of the exploiters necessarily will end in its complete disappearance, that is in the disappearance of the class of exploiters itself. Foreseeing this, we must already today what they call the spirit of history is only the spirit of these gentlemen themselves. Invent new forms of social organization in which there will no longer be any place for exploiters. On the basis of other qualities of human nature it is evident that these forms must be such and such. The plan of social reorganization was prepared very rapidly. The extremely important scientific conception of the conformity to law of social phenomena gave birth to a couple of utopian recipes. Such recipes were considered by the utopians of that day to be the most important problem with which a thinker was faced. This or that principle of political economy was not important in itself. It acquired importance in view of the practical conclusions which followed from it. Bichet argued with Ricardo about what determined the exchange value of commodities. Very possibly this is an important question from the point of view of specialists. But even more important is it to know what ought to determine value, and the specialists, unfortunately, do not attempt to think about this. Let us think for the specialists. Human nature very clearly tells us so and so. Once we begin to listen to its voice, we see with astonishment that the argument so important in the eyes of the specialists is, in reality, not very important. We can agree with, say, because from his theses there follow conclusions fully in harmony with the requirements of human nature. We can agree with Ricardo too, because his views likewise, being correctly interpreted and supplemented, can only reinforce those requirements. It was in this way that utopian thought unceremoniously interfered in those scientific discussions the meaning of which remained obscure for it. It was in this way that cultivated men, richly gifted by nature, as for example Infantin, decided the controversial questions of the political economy of their day. Infantin wrote a number of studies of political economy which cannot be considered a serious contribution to science, but which cannot also be ignored, as is done up to the present day by the historians of political economy and socialism. The economic works of Infantin have their significance as an interesting phase in the history of the development of socialist thought. But his attitude to the arguments of the economists is sufficiently illustrated by the following example. It is known that Malthus stubbornly and, by the way, very unsuccessfully contested Ricardo's theory of rent. Infantin thought that truth was, in fact, on the side of the first, and not of the second. But he did not contest Ricardo's theory either, he did not consider this necessary. In his opinion all discussions on the nature of rent and as to the actual relative rise or fall of the part taken by the property owners from the labourer ought to be reduced to one question: what is the nature of those relations which ought in the interests of society to exist between the producer who has withdrawn from affairs, that was the name given by Infantin to the landowners, and the active producer, that is the farmer. When these relations become known, it will be sufficient to ascertain the means which will lead to the establishment of such relations. In doing so it will be necessary to take into account also the present condition of society, but nevertheless any other question, apart from that set forth above, would be secondary, and would only impede those combinations which must promote the use of the above-mentioned means. The principal task of political economy, which Infantin would prefer to call the philosophical history of industry, consists in pointing out both the mutual relations of various strata of producers and the relationships of the whole class of producers with the other classes of society. These indications must be founded on the study of the historical development of the industrial class, and such a study must be founded on the new conception of the human race, that is in other words, of human nature. With Malthus the challenge to Ricardo's theory of rent was closely bound up with his challenge to the very well known as people now say labour theory of value. In his article, Considerations sur la best progressive de la des ob, paying little attention to the substance of the argument, Infantin hastened to resolve it by a utopian addition, or, as people in Russia say nowadays, amendment, to Ricardo's theory of rent. If we understand this theory aright, he says we ought, it seems to me, to add to it that the labourers pay, that is pay in the form of rent, some people for the leisure which those enjoy, and for the right to make use of the means of production. By labourers Infantin understood here also, and even principally, the capitalist farmers. What he said of their relations with the landowners is quite true. But in his amendment everything is reduced merely to a sharper expression of a phenomenon with which Ricardo himself was well acquainted. Moreover, this sharp expression, Adam Smith sometimes speaks even more sharply, not only did not solve the question either of value or of rent, but completely eliminated it from Infantin's field of view. But for him these questions did not in fact exist. He was interested solely in the future organization of society. It was important for him to convince the reader that private property in the means of production ought not to exist. Infantin even says plainly that, but for practical questions of this kind, all the learned disputes concerning value would be a simple dispute about words. This, so to speak, is the subjective method in political economy. The utopians never directly recommended this method. But that they were very partial to it is shown, among other ways, by the fact that Infantin reproached Malthus with excessive objectivity. Objectivity was, in his opinion, the principal fault of that writer. Whoever knows the works of Malthus is aware that it is precisely objectivity, so characteristic, for example, of Ricardo, that was always foreign to the author of the essay on the law of population. We do not know whether Infantin read Malthus himself. Everything obliges us to think that, for example, the views of Ricardo were known to him only from the extracts which the French economists made from his writings. But even if he did read them, he could hardly have assessed them at their true value. He would hardly have been able to show that real life was in contradiction to Malthus. Preoccupied with considerations about what ought to be, Infantin had neither the time nor the desire attentively to study what really existed. You are right, he was ready to say to the first sycophant he met. In present-day social life matters proceed just as you describe them, but you are excessively objective. Glance at the question from the humane point of view, and you will see that our social life must be rebuilt on new foundations. Utopian dilettantism was forced to make theoretical concessions to any more or less learned defender of the bourgeois order. In order to allay the consciousness rising within him of his own impotence, the utopian consoled himself by reproaching his opponents with objectivity. Let us admit you are more learned than I, but in return I am kinder. The utopian did not refute the learned defenders of the bourgeoisie. He only made footnotes and corrections to their theories. The Russian utopians a similar, quite utopian attitude to social science meets the eye of the attentive reader on every page of the works of our subjective sociologists. We shall have occasion yet to speak a good deal of such an attitude. Let us meanwhile quote two vivid examples. In 187 there appeared the dissertation by the late Sieber, on Ricardo's theory of value and capital, in the light of later elucidations. In his foreword the author benevolently, but only in passing, referred to the article of one Nikolai Ivanovich Sieber was a radical publicist and economist, the first Russian writer to popularize the work of Marx, in his university thesis mentioned above. After lecturing on political economy in Russia in 1873 May, he emigrated to Switzerland, where he wrote extensively on the economic teachings of Marx and kindred subjects, and criticized anti-Marxists like Zhukovsky in articles published in Russian reviews. He died after a mental illness in 1884. The following year his early thesis, doubled in size by later editions, was posthumously republished under the title of David Ricardo and Karl Marx in THR Social and Economic Research. It contained a fairly detailed exposition of the first volume of Capital, and from this book, and from his sketches of Russian economic culture, Russian youth in the 80s and early Goths derived much of their knowledge of Marxism. Marx, in the preface to his first volume, praised Sieber's excellent work in the field of theory. Sieber, however, to the end of his life remained a radical, and did not attempt to draw political conclusions from Marx's economic theory, nor did he clearly distinguish it from the bourgeois theory of Ricardo Trans. Mr. Zhukovsky won the school of Adam Smith and positivism in economic science. This article appeared in the Sovremennik of R 864. On the subject of this passing reference, Mr. Mikhailovsky remarks, "It is pleasant for me to recall that in my R6 Claire on the literary activity of Zhukovsky I paid a great and just tribute to the services rendered by our economist. I pointed out that Mr. Zhukovsky had long ago expressed the thought that it was necessary to return to the sources of political economy, in which there exist all the data for a correct solution of the main problems of science, data which have been quite distorted by the modern textbook political economy. But I then indicated also that the honor of priority in this idea, which later on proved so fruitful in the powerful hands of Karl Marx, belonged in Russian literature not to Mr. Zhukovsky, but to another writer, the author of the articles Economic Activity and Legislation, Capital and Labor, the footnotes to Mill, etc. In addition to seniority in time, the difference between this writer too and Mr. Zhukovsky can be expressed most Zhukovsky vividly in the following way. If, for example, Mr. Zhukovsky circumstantially and in a strictly scientific fashion, even somewhat pedantically, proves that labor is the measure of value and that every value is produced by labor, the author of the above-mentioned articles, without losing sight of the theoretical aspect of a question, lays principal stress on the logical and practical conclusion from it, being produced and measured by labor, every value must belong to labor. One does not have to be greatly versed in political economy to know that the author of the footnotes to Mill entirely failed to understand the theory of value which later received such brilliant development in the powerful hands of Marx. And every person who knows the history of socialism understands why that author, in spite of Mr. Mikhailovsky's assurances, did in fact lose sight of the theoretical aspect of a question, and wandered off into meditations on the basis on which products ought to be exchanged in a well-regulated society. The author of the footnotes to Mill regarded economic questions from the standpoint of a utopian. This was quite natural at the time. But it is very strange that Mr. Mikhailovsky was unable to divest himself of this point of view in the seminars, and did not do so even later, otherwise he would have corrected his mistake in the latest edition of his works, when it was easy to acquire a more correct view of things, even from popular works. Mr. Mikhailovsky did not understand what the author of the footnotes to Mill civil rights. He was allowed to return to European Russia in 1881, but forbidden to write for publication. Chernyshevsky died in 1889, but the very mention of his name was prohibited, so profound and extensive was his influence until 1905. Marx, in the preface to the second edition of Capital, paid tribute to his mastermind, and had told the Russian revolutionary Lepatin that of all modern economists Chernyshevsky represented the only truly original thinker and that Russians ought to be ashamed that none of them had taken the trouble so far to acquaint Europe with such a remarkable thinker. Engels, in 1894, spoke of Chernyshevsky as that great thinker to whom Russia owes so infinitely much. Lenin, in after years, wrote of Chernyshevsky's work as prophecies of genius, and of the man himself as one of the predecessors of Russian social democracy. In particular, Lenin called him a great Russian Hegelian and materialist, saying that, on the question of the relation between existence and thought, Chernyshevsky is entirely on Engels' level, but that the very backwardness of Russian life had prevented the great writer from fully rising to the level of the dialectical materialism of Marx and Engels. See also Krupskaya, Memories of Lenin, App. 3. Lenin and Chernyshevsky, and Lenin's Selected Works, English Eden. I. 419, 425, 4, 272, 11, 407-9, 538-42, 546, 554-7. Trans. Wrote about value. This took place because he too lost sight of the theoretical aspect of a question and wandered off into the logical practical conclusion from it, that is the consideration that every value ought to belong to labor. We know already that their passion for practical conclusions always had a harmful effect on the theoretical reasoning of the utopians. And how old is the conclusion, which turned Mr. Mikhailovsky from the true path, is shown by the circumstance that it was being drawn from Ricardo's theory of value by the English utopians, even of the I-82Os. But, as a utopian, Mr. Mikhailovsky is not interested even in the history of utopias. Another example. Mr. VV, in I-882, explained in the following way the appearance of his book, The Destinies of Capitalism in Russia. The collection now offered to the reader consists of articles printed earlier in various journals. In publishing them as a separate book, we have brought them only into external unity, disposed the material in a somewhat different fashion and eliminated repetitions. Far from all, very many of them remained in VV's book. Their content has remained the same. Few new facts and arguments have been adduced. And if nevertheless we venture for a second time to present our work to the attention of the reader, we do so with one sole aim, simultaneously attacking his world outlook with our whole arsenal, to force the intelligentsia to turn its attention to the question raised. An impressive picture. Mr. VV, with his whole arsenal, attacks the world outlook of the reader, and the terrified intelligentsia capitulates, turns its attention, etc., and to challenge our learned and professional publicists of capitalism and narodism, one, to study the law of the economic development of Russia, the foundation of all the other expression of the life of the country. Without the knowledge of this law, systematic and successful social activity is impossible, while the conceptions of the immediate future of Russia which prevail amongst us can scarcely won the view that capitalism in Russia was an accidental development, and that the peasantry, not the working class, would create Russian socialism, under the guidance of individual heroes from among the intellectuals. Trans. Be called a law, conceptions can be called law, and are hardly capable of providing a firm foundation for a practical world outlook. In 1893 the same Mr. VV, who had by now had time to become a professional, though, alas, still not a learned publicist of narodism, turned out to be now very remote from the idea that the law of economic development constitutes the foundation of all the other expressions of the life of the country. Now he with all his arsenal attacks the world outlook of people who hold such views. Now he considers that in this view, the historical process, instead of being the creation of man, is transformed into a creative force, and man into its obedient tool. 1. Now he considers social relations to be the creation of the spiritual world of man. 2. And views with extreme suspicion the theory of the conformity to law of social phenomena, setting up against it the scientific philosophy of history of Professor of History N.I. Karayev. Here, 0. Tongues, and be stilled, since the professor himself is with us. 3. What a change, with God's help. What brought it about? Why, this. In 1882 Mr. VV was looking for the law of the economic development of Russia, imagining that that law would be only the scientific expression of his own ideals. He was even convinced that he had discovered such a law, namely, the law that Russian capitalism was stillborn. But after this he did not live 11 whole years in vain. He was obliged to admit, even though not allowed, that stillborn capitalism was developing more and more. It turned out that the development of capitalism had become all but the most unquestionable law of the economic development of Russia. And lo, Mr. VV hastened to turn his philosophy of history inside out. He who had sought for a law, began to say that such a search is quite an idle waste of time. The Russian utopian is not averse to relying on a law, but he immediately renounces it, as Peter did to Jesus, if only the law is at variance with our trends. St. Petersburg, 1893, pages 138. To opposite, ppg, 13, 140, and many others. 3 Ibid, pages 143 et seq. That ideal, which he has to support, not only for fear, but for conscience sake. However, Mr. VV even yet has not quarreled with law forever. The natural striving to systematize its views ought to bring the Russian intelligentsia to the construction of an independent scheme of evolution of economic relations, appropriate to the requirements and the conditions of development of our country. And such a work, without doubt, will be performed in the not distant future. In constructing its independent scheme, the Russian intelligentsia will evidently devote itself to the same occupation as Mr. VV when, in his Destinies of Capitalism, he was looking for law. When the scheme is discovered and Mr. VV takes his Bible oath that it will be discovered in the immediate future, our author will just as solemnly make his peace with the principle of conformity to law, as the father in the testament made his peace with his prodigal son. Amusing people. It is obvious that, even at the time when Mr. VV was still looking for a law, he did not clearly realize what meaning this word could have when applied to social phenomena. He regarded law as the utopians of the 20s regarded it. Only this can explain the fact that he was hoping to discover the law of development of one country, Russia. But why does he attribute his modes of thought to the Russian Marxists? He is mistaken if he thinks that, in their understanding of the conformity of social phenomena to law, they have gone no further than the utopians did. And that he does think this, is shown by all his arguments against it. And not only he alone thinks this, the professor of history Mr. Karayev himself thinks this. And so do all the opponents of Marxism. First of all, they attribute to Marxists a utopian view of the conformity to law of social phenomena, and then strike down this view with more or less doubtful success. A real battle with windmills. By the way, about the learned professor of history. Here are the expressions in which he recommends the subjective view of the historical development of humanity. If in the philosophy of history we are interested in the question of progress, this very fact dictates the selection of the essential content of knowledge, its facts and their groupings. But facts cannot be either invented or placed in invented relations, consequently there must be nothing arbitrary either in the selection or in the grouping. Consequently the grouping must entirely correspond to objective reality? Yes. Just listen. And the presentation of the course of history from a certain point of view will remain objective, in the sense of the truth of the presentation. Here there appears on the scene subjectivism of another character. Creative synthesis may bring into existence an entire ideal world of norms, a world of what ought to be, a world of the true and just, with which actual history, that is the objective representation of its course, grouped in a certain way from the standpoint of essential changes in the life of humanity, will be compared. On the basis of this comparison there arises an assessment of the historical process which, however, must also not be arbitrary. It must be proved that the grouped facts, as we have them, really do have the significance which we attribute to them, having taken up a definite point of view and adopted a definite criterion for their evaluation. Shedrin writes of a venerable Moscow historian who, boasting of his objectivity, used to say, "It's all the same to me whether Yaroslav beat Tsaslav or Tsaslavich Yaroslav." Mr. Karayev, having created for himself an entire ideal world of norms, a world of what ought to be, a world of the true and just, has nothing to do with objectivity of that kind. He sympathizes, shall we say, with Yaroslav, and although he will not allow himself to represent his defeat as though it were his victory, facts cannot be invented, nevertheless he reserves the precious right of shedding a tear or two about the sad fate of Yaroslav, and cannot refrain from a curse addressed to his conqueror Tsaslav. It is difficult to raise any objection to that kind of subjectivism. But in vain does Mr. Karayev represent it in such a colourless and therefore harmless plight. To present it in this way means not to understand its true nature, and to drown it in a draught of sentimental phraseology. In reality, the distinguishing feature of subjective thinkers consists in the fact that for them the world of what ought to be, the world of the true and just stands outside any connection with the objective course of historical development. On one side is what ought to be, on the other side is reality, and these two spheres are separated by an entire abyss, that abyss which among the dualists separates the material world from the spiritual world. The task of social science in the 19th century has been, among other things, to build a bridge across this evidently bottomless abyss. So long as we do not build this bridge, we shall of necessity close our eyes to reality and concentrate all our attention on what ought to be, as the Saint Simonists did, for example, which naturally will only have the effect of delaying the bringing into effect of this what ought to be, since it renders more difficult the forming of an accurate opinion of it. Government and economic conditions. We already know that the historians of the Restoration, in contradistinction to the writers of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, regarded the political institutions of any country as the result of its civil conditions. This new view spread and developed to such an extent, at that time, that in its application to practical questions it reached strange extremes which to us nowadays are almost incomprehensible. Thus, J.B. Say asserted that political questions should not interest an economist, because the national economy can develop equally well even with diametrically opposite political systems. Saint Simon notes and applauds this idea of Say's, although in fact he does give it a rather more profound content. With very few exceptions, all the utopians of the 19th century share this view of politics. Theoretically the view is mistaken in two respects. In the first place, the people who held it forgot that in the life of society, as everywhere where it is a case of a process and not of some isolated phenomenon, a consequence becomes, in its turn, a cause, and the cause proves to be a consequence. In short, they abandoned here, at quite the wrong moment, that very point of view of interaction to which in other cases, also at very much the wrong moment, they limed their analysis. Secondly, if political relations are the consequence of social relations, it is incomprehensible how consequences which differ to the extreme, political institutions of a diametrically opposite character, can be brought about by one and the same cause, the same state of wealth. Evidently the very conception of the causal relationship between the political institutions of a country and its economic condition was still extremely vague. And in fact it would not be difficult to show how vague it was with all the utopians. In practice this vagueness brought about a double consequence. On the one hand the utopians, who spoke so much about the organization of labor, were ready occasionally to repeat the old watchword of the 18th century, laissez-faire, laissez-passer. Thus, Saint Simon, who saw in the organization of industry the greatest task of the 19th century, wrote, "Industry has need of being governed as little as possible." 1. On the other hand the utopians, again with some exceptions falling in the later period, were quite indifferent to current politics, to the political questions of the day. The political system is a consequence, not a cause. A consequence always remains a consequence, never becoming in its turn a cause. Hence followed the almost direct conclusion that politics cannot serve as a means of bringing about social and economic ideals. We can therefore understand the psychology of the utopian who turned away from politics. But what did they reckon on, then, in realizing their plans of social transformation? What was at the bottom of their practical hopes? Everything and nothing. Everything in the sense that they awaited help indifferently from the most opposed quarters. Nothing in the sense that all the hopes were quite unfounded. The writers of the Enlightenment in the 18th century contradicted themselves in just the same way, although their contradiction displayed itself otherwise. They stood for non-interference by the state, and yet at times required the most petty regulation by the legislator. To them the connection of politics, which they considered a cause, with economy, which they considered a consequence, was also unclear. The utopians imagined that they were extremely practical people. They hated doctrinaires, and all their loudest principles they sacrificed, without hesitation, to their own fixed ideas. They were neither liberals, nor conservatives, nor monarchists, nor republicans. They were quite ready to march indifferently with the liberals and with the conservatives, with the monarchists and with the republicans, if only they could bring about their practical, in their view, extremely practical plans. Among the old utopians Fourier was particularly noteworthy in this respect. Like Gogol's Kostanjoglo, he tried to use every piece of rubbish for the good cause. Now he allured moneylenders with the prospect of the vast interest which their capital would bring them in the future society. Now he appealed to the lovers of melons and artichokes, drawing for them a seductive picture of the excellent melons and artichokes of the future. Now he assured Louis Philippe that the princesses of the House of Orleans, at whom at the time other princes of the blood were turning up their noses, would have no peace from suitors under the new social order. He snatched at every straw. But, alas! Neither the moneylenders, nor the lovers of melons and artichokes, nor the citizen king, as they say, pricked up an ear. They did not pay the slightest attention to what, it might have seemed, were the most convincing arguments of Fourier. His practicality turned out to be doomed beforehand to failure, and to be a joyless chase of some happy accident. The chase of the happy accident was the constant occupation of the writers of the Enlightenment in the 18th century as well. It was just in hope of such an accident that they sought by every means, fair and foul, to enter into friendly relations with more or less enlightened legislators, and aristocrats of their age. Usually it is thought that once a man has said to himself that opinion governs the world, he no longer has any reason to despair of the future, la raison finira par avoir raison. But this is not so. When and in what way will reason triumph? The writers of the Enlightenment said that in the life of society everything depends, in the long run, on the legislator. Therefore they went on their search for legislators. But the same writers knew very well that the character and views of man depend on his upbringing, and that generally speaking their upbringing did not predispose the legislators to the absorption of enlightened doctrines. Therefore they could not but realize that there was little hope of the legislators. There remained only to trust to some happy accident. Imagine that you have an enormous box in which there are very many black balls and 2 or 3 white ones. You take out ball after ball. In each individual case you have incomparably fewer chances of taking out a white ball than a black. But, if you repeat the operation a sufficient number of times, you will finally take out a white ball. The same applies to the legislators. In each individual case it is incomparably more probable that the legislator will be against the philosophers, but in the end there must appear, after all, a legislator who is in agreement with the philosophers. This one will do everything that reason dictates. Thus, literally thus, did Helvetius argue. 1. The subjective idealist view of history, opinions govern the world, which seems to provide such a wide field for man's freedom of action, in reality represents him as the plaything of accident. That is why this view in its essence is very joyless. Thus, for example, we know nothing more joyless than the views of the utopians of the end of the 19th century, that is the Russian narodniks and subjective sociologists. Each of them has his ready-made plan for saving the Russian VMAGE community, and with it the peasantry generally, each of them has his formula of progress. But, alas, life moves on, without paying attention to their formulae, which have nothing left but to find their own path also, independently of real life, into the sphere of abstractions, fantasies and logical mischances. Let us, for example, listen to the Achilles of the subjective school, Mr. Mikhailovsky. The labor question in Europe is a revolutionary question since it requires the transfer of the conditions one dans un temps plus ou moins long faut, descent. Is sages, que touts. Is possibilites se realisant, pour croire des espera du bon futur de l'humanité, etc. Of labor into the hands of the laborer, the expropriation of the present owners. The labor question in Russia is a conservative question, since here all that is needed is preserving the conditions of labor in the hands of the laborer, guaranteeing to the present owners their existing property. Quite close to Petersburg itself. In a district dotted with factories, works, parks, country cottages, there are villages the inhabitants of which live on their own land, burn their own timber, eat their own bread, wear coats and sheepskins made by their own labor out of the wool of their own sheep. Give them a firm guarantee that this property of theirs will remain their own, and the Russian labor question is solved. And for the sake of such a purpose everything else can be given up, if we properly understand the significance of a stable guarantee. It will be said, but we cannot forever remain with wooden plows and three-field economy, with antediluvian methods of making coats and sheepskins. We cannot. There are 2 ways out of this difficulty. 1. Approved by the practical point of view, is very simple and convenient. Raise the tariffs, dissolve the village community, and probably that will be enough. Industry like that of Great Britain will grow up like a mushroom. But it will devour the laborer and expropriate him. There is another way, of course much more difficult, but the simple solution of a question is not the same necessarily as the correct solution. The other way consists in developing those relations between labor and property which already exist, although in an extremely rude and primitive form. Obviously this end cannot be achieved without broad intervention by the state, the first act of which should be the legislative consolidation of the village community. 1. Through the wide world for the free heart there are 2 paths still. Weigh your proud strength, bend your firm mind, choose which you will. 1. Works of N. Mikhailovsky, 2nd Eden. Vol. 2, pages 102-3. We suspect that all the arguments of our author have a strong aroma of melons and artichokes. And our sense of smell hardly deceives us. What was Fourier's mistake in his dealings with melons and artichokes? It was that he fell into subjective sociology. The objective sociologist would ask himself, is there any probability that the amateurs of melons and artichokes will be attracted by the picture I have drawn? He would then ask himself, are the amateurs of melons and artichokes in a position to alter existing social relations and the present course of their development? It is most probable that he would have given himself a negative reply to each of these questions, and therefore would not have wasted his time on conversation with these amateurs. But that is how an objective sociologist would have acted, that is a man who founded all his calculations upon the given course of social development in conformity to law. The subjective sociologist, on the other hand, expels conformity to law in the name of the desirable, and therefore there remains no other way out for him but to trust in chance. As the old Russian saying has it, in a tight corner you can shoot with a stick too, that is the only consoling reflection upon which a good subjective sociologist can rely. In a tight corner you can shoot with a stick too. But a stick has two ends, and we do not know which end it shoots from. Our neurodniks and, if I may use the expression, subjectivists have already tried a vast number of sticks. Even the argument as to the convenience of collecting arrears of taxes in the village community system of landholding has sometimes appeared in the role of a magic stick. In the vast majority of cases the sticks proved quite incapable of playing the part of guns, and when by chance they did fire, the bullets hit the neurodniks and subjectivists themselves. Let us recall the peasant bank. What hopes were placed upon it, in the sense of reinforcing our social foundations? How the neurodniks rejoiced when it was opened. And what happened? The stick fired precisely at those who were rejoicing. Now they themselves admit that the peasant bank, a very valuable institution in any case, only undermines the foundations. And this admission is equivalent to a confession that they who rejoiced were at least for some time also engaged in idle chatter. But then the bank undermines the foundations only because its statutes and its practice do not completely correspond to our idea. If our idea had been completely applied, the results would have been quite different. In the first place, they would not have been quite different at all. The bank in any case would have facilitated the development of money economy, and money economy would inexorably have undermined the foundations. And secondly, when we hear these endless ifs, it seems all the time to us, for some reason, that there is a man with a barrow shouting under our windows, "Here are melons, melons, and good artichokes." It was already in the 20s of the present century that the French utopians were incessantly pointing up the conservative character of the reforms they had invented. Saint Simon openly tried to frighten both the government and what we nowadays call society with a popular insurrection, which was meant to present itself to the imaginations of the conservatives in the shape of the terrible movement of the sans-culottes, still vividly remembered by all. But of course nothing came of this frightening, and if history really provides us with any lessons, one of the most instructive is that which attests the complete unpracticality of all the plans of all the would-be practical utopians. The utopians and history, when the utopians, pointing to the conservative character of their plans, tried to incline the government to put them into effect, they usually, to confirm their idea, presented a survey of the historical development of their country over a more or less prolonged epoch, a survey from which it followed that on these or those particular occasions mistakes were made, which had given a quite new and extremely undesirable aspect to all social relations. The government had only to realize and correct these mistakes immediately to establish on earth something almost resembling paradise. Thus, Saint Simon assured the Bourbons that before the Revolution the main distinguishing feature of the internal development of France was an alliance between the monarchy and the industrialists. This alliance was equally advantageous for both sides. During the Revolution the government, through a misunderstanding, went against the legitimate demands of the industrialists, and the industrialists, through just as sad a misunderstanding, revolted against the monarchy. Hence all the evils of the age that followed. But now, when the root of the evil had been discovered, things could be put right very easily, as the industrialists had only to make their peace on certain conditions with the government. It is this that would be the most reasonable, conservative way out of the numerous difficulties of both sides. It is unnecessary to add now that neither the Bourbons nor the industrialists followed the sage advice of Saint Simon. Instead of firmly keeping to our age-old traditions, instead of developing the principle of the intimate connection between the means of production and the direct producer, which we inherited, instead of taking advantage of the acquisitions of Western European science and applying them for the development of forms of industry, founded on the possession by the peasantry of the implements of production, instead of increasing the productivity of its labor by concentrating the means of production in its hands, instead of taking advantage, not of the form of production, but of its very organization as it appears in Western Europe. Instead of all this, we have taken a quite opposite path. We not only have not prevented the development of the capitalist forms of production, in spite of the fact that they are founded on the expropriation of the peasantry, but on the contrary have tried with all our strength to promote the complete break-up of all our economic life, a break-up which led to the famine of 1891. One thus laments Mr. Renan, recommending society to correct this mistake, by solving an extremely difficult but not impossible problem, to develop the productive forces of the population in such a form that not an insignificant minority, but the entire people could take advantage of them. Everything depends upon correcting the mistake. It is interesting that Mr. Renan imagines himself to be ever so foreign to any utopias. Every minute he makes references to people to whom we owe the scientific criticism of utopian socialism. Everything depends on the country's economy, he repeats in season and out of season, echoing these people, and all the evil springs from this. Therefore the means to eliminate the evil, once it has been discovered, must consist likewise in altering the very conditions of production. To explain this he once again quotes one of the critics of utopian socialism: "These means must not be invented by the mind, but discovered by means of the mind in the existing material facts of production." But in what, then, consist those material facts of production, which will move society to solve, or at least to tackle, the problem presented to it by Mr. Renan? this remains a mystery not only for the reader but, of one Nikolai N. Danielson, Olens of our social economy since the Reform, Street. Course, for the author himself as well. By his problem he has very convincingly demonstrated that in his historical views he remains a pure-blooded utopian, in spite of his quotations from the works of quite non-utopian writers. Can it be said that the plans of Fourier contradicted the material facts of production in his times? No, not only did they not contradict them, but they were entirely founded upon those facts, even in their defects. But this did not prevent Fourier from being a utopian, because, once having founded his plan by means of the mind on the material conditions of the production of his age, he failed to adapt its realization to those same conditions, and therefore with complete futility pestered with his great task those social strata and classes which, in virtue of those same material conditions, could not have either the inclination to set about its solution or the possibility of solving it. Mr. Renan sins in this way just as much as Fourier or the Rodbertus whom he loves so little. Most of all he reminds one precisely of Rodbertus, because Mr. Renan's reference to age-old traditions is just in the spirit of that conservative writer. For the better instruction of society, Mr. Renan points to the terrifying example of Western Europe. By such observations our utopians have long attempted to give themselves the aspect of positive people, who don't get led away by fantasies and who merely know how to take advantage of the lessons of history. But this method too, is not at all new. The French utopians were already attempting to terrify their contemporaries and make them listen to reason by the example of England, correspondingly, where a vast distance separates the employer from the workman, and where there hangs over the latter the yoke of a special kind of despotism. Other countries which follow England along the path of industrial development, said the productor, must understand that they ought to prevent such a system arising on their own soil. The only real obstacle to the appearance of English methods in other countries could be the Saint-Simonist organization of labor, and laborers point to with the development of the labor movement in France it was Germany that became the principal theater of daydreams about avoiding capitalism. Germany, in the person of her utopians, long and stubbornly set herself up against Western Europe, Den Westlichen Landren. In the Western countries, said the German utopians, the bearer of the idea of a new organization of society is the working class, with us it is the educated classes, what is called in Russia the intelligentsia. It was precisely the German intelligentsia, which was thought to be called upon to avert from Germany the cup of capitalism. 3. Capitalism was so terrifying to the German utopians that, for the sake of avoiding it, they were ready in the last resort to put up with complete stagnation. The triumph of a constitutional system, they argued, would lead to the supremacy of the money aristocracy. Therefore let there either be no constitutional system. Germany did not avoid capitalism. Now it is the Russian utopians who talk about avoiding it. Thus the utopian ideas journey from west to east, everywhere appearing as the heralds of the victory of that same capitalism against which they are in revolt and are struggling. But the further they penetrate into the east the more the historical significance changes. The French utopians were in their day bold innovators of genius. The Germans proved much lower than they. And the Russians are now capable only of frightening Western people by their antediluvian appearance. It is interesting that even the writers of the French Enlightenment had the idea of avoiding capitalism. Thus, Holbach was very upset by the fact that the triumph of the constitutional order in England led to the complete supremacy of the sordid interests of the merchants. He was very saddened by the circumstance that the English were tirelessly looking for new markets. Such a chasing of markets distracted them from philosophy. Holbach also condemned the inequality of property existing in England. Like Helvetius, he would have liked to prepare the way for the triumph of reason and equality, and not of mercantile interests. But neither Holbach nor Helvetius, nor any other of the writers of the Enlightenment could put forward anything against the then course of events except panegyrics of reason and moral instructions addressed to the people of Albion. In this respect they were just as impotent as our own Russian utopians, in our day. Biological analogies one more remark, and we shall have finished with the utopians. The point of view of human nature brought one should the constitutionalists succeed, said Bietner, in overthrowing the German governments and introducing a universal monarchy or republic, we should get here an aristocracy of money as in France, and better it should remain as it now is. Fourth, in the first half of the 19th century that abuse of biological analogies which, even up to the present day, makes itself very strongly felt in Western sociological and particularly in Russian quasi-sociological literature. If the explanation of all historical social progress is to be sought in the nature of man, and if, as Saint Simon himself justly remarks, society consists of individuals, then the nature of the individual has to provide the key to the explanation of history. The nature of the individual is the subject of physiology in the broad sense of the word, that is of a science which also covers psychological phenomena. That is why physiology, in the eyes of Saint Simon and his followers, was the basis of sociology, which they called social physics. In the Opinions philosophiques, littéraires et industrielles published during Saint Simon's lifetime and with his active participation, there was printed an extremely interesting but unfortunately unfinished article of an anonymous doctor of medicine, entitled, On Physiology Applied to the Improvement of Social Institutions. The author considered the science of society to be a component part of general physiology which, enriched by the observations and experiments of special physiology of the individual, devotes itself to considerations of a higher order. Individuals are for it only organs of the social body, the functions of which it studies just as special physiology studies the functions of individuals. General physiology studies, the author writes, expresses the laws of social existence, with which the written laws should be accordingly coordinated. Later on the bourgeois sociologists, as for example Spencer, made use of the doctrine of the social organism to draw the most conservative conclusions. But the doctor of medicine whom we quote was first of all a reformer. He studied the social body with the object of social reconstruction, since only social physiology, and the hygiene closely bound up with it provided the positive foundations on which it is possible to build the system of social organization required by the present state of the civilized world. But evidently social physiology and hygiene did not provide much food for the reforming fantasy of the author, because in the end he found himself obliged to turn to the doctors, that is to persons dealing with individual organisms, asking them to give to society, in the form of a hygienic prescription, a system of social organization. This view of social physics was later on chewed over or, if you prefer, developed by Auguste Comte in his various works. Here is what he said about social science even in his youth, when he was writing in the Saint Simonist Producta: social phenomena, being human phenomena, should without doubt be classed among physiological phenomena. But although social physics must therefore find its point of departure in individual physiology, and be in constant connection with the latter, it nevertheless should be examined and developed as quite a separate science, for this reason, that various generations of men progressively influence one another. If we maintain the purely physiological point of view, we cannot properly study that influence, yet its evaluation should occupy the principal place in social physics. One but see into what hopeless contradictions fall the people who regard society from this point of view. In the first place, since social physics has individual physiology as its point of departure, it is built on a purely materialist foundation. In physiology there is no place for an idealist view of an object. But the same social physics was principally to concern itself with evaluating the progressive influence of one generation on another. One generation influences the next, passing on to it both the knowledge which it inherited from previous generations, and the knowledge which it acquired itself. Social physics therefore examines the development of the human species from the point of view of the development of knowledge and of enlightenment, Lumiere's. This is already the purely idealist point of view of the 18th century. Opinions govern the world. Having closely connected, on Comte's advice, this idealistic point of view with the purely one consideration sur les sciences et les savants in producta, vol. I, pages 355-6. Materialist point of view of individual physiology, we turn out to be dualists of the purest water, and nothing is easier than to trace the harmful influence of this dualism on the sociological views even of the same Comte. But this is not all. Even the thinkers of the 18th century noticed that in the development of knowledge there is a certain conformity to law. Comte firmly maintained such a conformity, putting forward into the foreground the notorious law of three stages, theological, metaphysical and positive. But why then does the development of knowledge pass precisely through these stages? Such is the nature of the human mind, replies Comte. By its nature, the human mind passes wherever it acts through three different theoretical conditions. 1. Excellent. But to study that nature we shall have to turn to individual physiology, and individual physiology does not give us a sufficient explanation. And we have again to refer to previous generations, and the generations again send us back to nature. This is called a science, but there is no trace of science in it, there is only an endless movement round a vicious circle. Our own allegedly original subjective sociologists completely adopt the viewpoint of the French utopian of the 20s. While I was still under the influence of Nuzin, Mr. Mikhailovsky tells us about himself, and partly under his guidance, I interested myself in the question of the boundaries between biology and sociology, and the possibility of bringing them together. I cannot sufficiently highly assess the advantage I gained from communion with the ideas of Nuzin, but nevertheless there was much in them that was accidental, partly because in Nuzin himself they were still only developing, partly because of his limited knowledge in the sphere of the natural sciences. I received from Nuzin really only an impulse in a certain direction, but it was a strong, decisive and beneficent impulse. Without thinking of any special study of biology, I nevertheless read a great deal on Nuzin's suggestion and, as it were, by his testament. 1 Ibid, pages 304. This new trend in my reading threw an original and most absorbing light on that considerable though disorderly, and to some extent simply useless material, both of facts and ideas, which I had stored up previously. 1 Nuzin has been described by Mr. Mikhailovsky in his sketches in the intervals, under the name of Plekhanov. Plekhanov dreamed of reforming the social sciences with the help of natural science, and had already worked out an extensive plan for that purpose. The methods of this reforming activity can be seen from the following. Plekhanov undertakes to translate into Russian from the Latin an extensive treatise on zoology, and accompanies the translation with his own footnotes, in which he proposes to include the results of all his independent work, while to these footnotes he adds new footnotes of a sociological character. Mr. Mikhailovsky obligingly acquaints the reader with one such second-story footnote. Generally speaking, I cannot in my supplement to Van der Rueven proceed too far in theoretical discussions and conclusions regarding the application of all these purely anatomical questions in solving social and economic questions. Therefore I again only draw the attention of the reader to the fact that my whole anatomical and embryological theory has as its main object the discovery of the laws of the physiology of society, and therefore all my later works will, of course, be founded on the scientific data set forth by me in this book. 2 Anatomical and embryological theory has as its main object the discovery of the laws of the physiology of society. This is very awkwardly put, but nevertheless is very characteristic for the utopian sociologists. He constructs an anatomical theory, with the help of which he intends to write out a number of hygienic prescriptions for the society surrounding him. It is to these prescriptions that his social physiology is reduced. The social physiology of Buckhartsev is, strictly speaking, not physiology, but the hygiene with one literature and life, in Ruskaya Mysl, 1891, vol. 4, pages 195 to works of N.K. Mikhailovsky, vol. 4, 2nd Eden. Pages 265 to 6. Which we are already acquainted, not a science of what is, but a science of what ought to be, on the basis of the anatomical and embryological theory of that same Buckhartsev. Although Buckhartsev has been copied from Enozin, nevertheless he represents to a certain extent the product of the artistic creative work of Mr. Mikhailovsky, that is, if we can speak of artistic work in relation to the sketches quoted. Consequently even his awkward footnote, perhaps, never existed in reality. In that event it is all the more characteristic of Mr. Mikhailovsky, who speaks of Nozin with great respect. I chance nevertheless to come across the direct reflection in literature of the ideas of my unforgettable friend and teacher, says Tyomkin, in whose name the story is told. Mr. Mikhailovsky reflected, and still reflects, the ideas of Buckhartsev Nozin. Mr. Mikhailovsky has his formula of progress. This formula declares, progress is the gradual approach to the integrity of the individual, to the fullest possible and most manifold division of labor between the organs and the least possible division of labor between people. Everything is immoral, unjust, harmful, unreasonable which delays this movement. Only that is moral, just, reasonable and useful which diminishes the heterogeneity of society, thereby increasing the heterogeneity of its individual members. What can be the scientific importance of this formula? Does it explain the historical progress of society? Does it tell how that progress took place, and why it took place in one particular way and not in another? Not in the least, and its main aim is not that at all. It speaks not of how history advanced, but of how it ought to have advanced, in order to earn the approval of Mr. Mikhailovsky. This is a hygienic prescription invented by a utopian on the basis of exact investigations of the laws of organic development. It is just what the St. Simonist doctor was looking for. We have said that the exclusive use in sociology of the objective method would be equivalent, if it were one ibid, pages 186 to 7. Possible, to adding up Harshins and Poods, one whence, by the way, it follows, not that the objective method must be completely eliminated from this sphere of research, but only that the supreme control must belong to the subjective method in this case. Point to this sphere of research is precisely the physiology of the desired society, the sphere of utopia. Naturally the use of the subjective method in it very much facilitates the work of the investigator. But this use is based not at all on any laws, but on the enchantment of charming fantasy. Whoever once has given way to it, will never revolt even against their use in one and the same sphere. True, with different rights of both methods, subjective and objective, even though such a confusion of methods really does mean adding up Harshins and Poods. 3-1 The first is a measure of length, the second of weight, thus it is like saying that yards should be added to hundredweights. Trans. 2 ibid, pages 185. 3 Incidentally, these very expressions subjective method represent a vast confusion, at the very least in terminology. Chapter 4, Idealist German Philosophy. The materialists of the 18th century were firmly convinced that they had succeeded in giving the death blow to idealism. They regarded it as an obsolete and forever abandoned theory. But already at the end of that century there began a reaction against materialism, and in the first half of the 19th century materialism itself fell into the position of a system which all considered obsolete and buried, once for all. Idealism not only came to life again, but underwent an unprecedented and truly brilliant development. There were, of course, appropriate social reasons for this, but we will not touch on them here, and will only consider whether the idealism of the 19th century had any advantages over the materialism of the previous epoch and, if it had, in what these advantages consisted. French materialism displayed an astonishing and today scarcely credible feebleness, every time it came upon questions of evolution in nature or in history. Let us take, for example, the origin of man. Although the idea of the gradual evolution of this species did not seem contradictory to the materialists, nevertheless they thought such a guess to be most improbable. The authors of the system de la nature say that if anyone were to revolt against such a piece of guesswork, if anyone were to object that nature acts with the help of a certain sum of general and invariable laws, and added in doing so that man, the quadruped, the fish, the insect, the plant, etc. exist from the beginning of time and remain eternally unaltered, they would not object to this. They would only remark that such a view also does not contradict the truth they set forth. Man does not need to know everything, he does not need to know his origin. That is all that in the end the authors of the system de la nature say about this important question. Helvetius seems to be more inclined to the idea of the gradual evolution of man. Matter is eternal, but its forms are variable, he remarks, recalling that even now human natures change under the influence of climate. He even considered that generally speaking all animal species were variable. But this sound idea was formulated by him very strangely. It followed, in his view, that the causes of dissimilarity between the different species of animals and vegetables lie either in the qualities of their very embryos, or in the differences of their environment, the differences of their upbringing. Point 2 Thus heredity excludes variability, and vice versa. If we adopt the theory of variability, we must as a consequence presuppose that from any given embryo there can arise, in appropriate circumstances, any animal or vegetable, from the embryo of an oak, for example, a bull or a giraffe. Naturally such a guess could not throw any light on the question of the origin of species, and Helvetius himself, having once made it in passing, does not once return to it again. just as badly were the French materialists able to explain phenomena of social evolution. The various systems of legislation were represented by them solely as the product of the conscious creative activity of legislators. The various religious systems as the product of the cunning of priests, etc. This impotence of French materialism in face of questions of evolution in nature and in history made its philosophical content very poor. In its view of nature, that content reduced itself to combating the one-sided conception of matter held by the dualists. In its view of man it confined itself to an endless repetition of, and some variations upon, Locke's principle that there are no innate ideas. However valuable such repetition was in combating out-of-date moral and political theories, it could have serious scientific value only if the materialists had succeeded in applying their conception to the explanation of the spiritual evolution of mankind. We have already said earlier that some very remarkable one Lavriesens du Système for de la Nature, London, 1774, pages 15. 2 Helvetius, Complete Works, Paris 1818, vol. 2, pages 120. Attempts were made in this direction by the French materialists, that is to be precise, by Helvetius, but that they ended in failure, and if they had succeeded, French materialism would have proved very strong in questions of evolution. The materialists, in their view of history, took up a purely idealistic standpoint that opinions govern the world. Only at times, only very rarely, did materialism break into the historical reflections, in the shape of remarks that some stray atom, finding its way into the head of the legislator, and causing in it a disturbance of the functions of the brain, might alter the course of history for entire ages. Such materialism was essentially fatalism, and left no room for the anticipation of events, that is for the conscious historical activity of thinking individuals. It is not surprising, therefore, that to capable and talented people who had not been drawn into that struggle of social forces in which materialism had been a terrible theoretical weapon of the extreme left party, this doctrine seemed dry, gloomy, melancholy. That was, for example, how Goethe spoke of it. In order that this reproach should cease to be deserved, materialism had to leave its dry and abstract mode of thought, and attempt to understand and explain real life, the complex and variegated chain of concrete phenomena, from its own point of view. But in its then form it was incapable of solving that great problem, and the latter was taken possession of by idealist philosophy. The main and final link in the development of that philosophy was the system of Hegel, therefore we shall refer principally to that system in our exposition. Hegel called metaphysical the point of view of those thinkers irrespective of whether they were idealists or materialists who, not being able to understand the process of development of phenomena, willy-nilly represent them to themselves and others as petrified, disconnected, incapable of passing one into another. To this point of view he opposed dialectics, which studies phenomena precisely in their development and consequently, in their mutual connection. According to Hegel, dialectics is the principle of any kind of life. Frequently one meets people who, having expressed some abstract proposition, willingly recognize that perhaps they are mistaken, and that perhaps the exactly opposite point of view is correct. These are welled people, saturated to their fingertips with tolerance. Live and let live, they say to their intellect. Dialectics has nothing in common with the skeptical tolerance of men of the world, but it too knows how to reconcile directly opposite abstract propositions. Man is mortal, we say, regarding death as something rooted in external circumstances and quite alien to the nature of living man. It follows that a man has two qualities, first of being alive, and secondly of also being mortal. But upon closer investigation it turns out that life itself bears in itself the germ of death, and that in general any phenomenon is contradictory, in the sense that it develops out of itself the elements which, sooner or later, will put an end to its existence and will transform it into its own opposite. Everything flows, everything changes. And there is no force capable of holding back this constant flux, or arresting this eternal movement. There is no force capable of resisting the dialectics of phenomena. Goethe personifies dialectics in the shape of a spirit, in Lebenswesen, im Latinstium, Warwick, auf und ab, way hinunter. Gebet und Grab, in Ewigesmeer, in Wechselnd Weben, in Gleichen so schajfik am Sorsenden Webstel der Z, 8, und work der Goethe is cleared. One at a particular moment a moving body is at a particular spot, but at the same time it is outside it also. Because, one in the tides of life, in action's storm, a fluctuant wave, a shuttle-free, birth and the grave, an eternal sea, a weaving, flowing, life, all glowing, thus at times humming loomed his my hand prepares the garment of life which the deity wears. Faust, Part 1, Scene R, by Yard Taylor's translation. If it were only in that spot, it would, at least for that moment, become motionless. Every motion is a dialectical process, a living contradiction, and as there is not a single phenomenon of nature in explaining which we do not have in the long run to appeal to motion, we have to agree with Hegel, who said that dialectics is the soul of any scientific cognition. And this applies not only to cognition of nature. What for example is the meaning of the old saw, summum jus, summa injuria? Does it mean that we act most justly when, having paid our tribute to law, we at the same time give its due to lawlessness? No, that is the interpretation only of surface thinking, the mind of fools. The aphorism means that every abstract justice, carried to its logical conclusion, is transformed into injustice, that is into its own opposite. Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice serves as a brilliant illustration of this. Take a look at economic phenomena. What is the logical conclusion of free competition? Every capitalist strives to beat his competitors and to remain sole master of the market. And, of course, cases are frequent when some Rothschild or Vanderbilt succeeds in happily fulfilling this ambition. But this shows that free competition leads to monopoly, that is to the negation of competition, that is to its own opposite. Or look at the conclusion to which the so-called labor principle of property, extolled by our narrative literature, leads. Only that belongs to me which has been created by my labor. Nothing can be more just than that. And it is no less just that I use the thing I have created at my own free discretion, I use it myself or I exchange it for something else, which for some reason I desire. It is equally just, then, that I make use of the thing I have secured by exchange again at my free discretion as I find pleasant, best and advantageous. Let us now suppose that I have sold the product of my own labor for money, and have used the money to hire a laborer, that is, I have bought somebody else's labor power. Having taken advantage of this labor power of another, I turn out to be the owner of value which is considerably higher than the value I spend on its purchase. This, on the one hand, is very just, because it has already been recognized, after all, that I can use what I have secured by exchange as is best and most advantageous for myself, and, on the other hand, it is very unjust, because I am exploiting the labor of another and thereby negating the principle which lay at the foundation of my conception of justice. The property acquired by my personal labor bears me the property created by the labor of another. Summum jus, summa injuria. And such injuria springs up by the very nature of things in the economy of almost any well-to-do handicraftsman, almost every prosperous peasant. One and so every phenomenon, by the action of those same forces which condition its existence, sooner or later, but inevitably, is transformed into its own opposite. We have said that the idealist German philosophy regarded all phenomena from the point of view of their evolution, and that this is what is meant by regarding them dialectically. It must be remarked that the metaphysicians know how to distort the very doctrine of evolution itself. They affirm that neither in nature nor in history are there any leaps. When they speak of the origin of some phenomenon or social institution, they represent matters as though this phenomenon or institution was once upon a time very tiny, quite unnoticeable, and then gradually grew up. When it is a question of destroying this or that phenomenon and institution, they presuppose, on the contrary, its gradual diminution, continuing up to the point when the phenomenon becomes quite unnoticeable on account of its microscopic dimensions. Evolution conceived of in this way explains absolutely nothing. It presupposes the existence of the phenomena which it has to explain, and reckons only with the quantitative changes which take place in them. The supremacy of metaphysical thought. One Mr. Mikhailovsky thinks this eternal and ubiquitous supremacy of dialectics incomprehensible. Everything changes except the laws of dialectical was once so powerful in natural science that many naturalists could not imagine evolution otherwise than just in the form of such a gradual increase or diminution of the magnitude of the phenomenon being investigated. Although from the time of Harvey it was already recognized that everything living develops out of the egg, no exact conception was linked, evidently, with such development from the egg, and the discovery of spermatozoa immediately served as the occasion for the appearance of a theory according to which in the seminal cell there already existed a ready-made, completely developed but microscopical little animal, so that all its development amounted to growth. Just in the same way wise sages now argue, among them many famous European evolutionary sociologists, about the evolution, for example, of political institutions. History makes no jumps, va piano, go softly. German idealist philosophy decisively revolted against such a misshapen conception of evolution. Hegel bitingly ridiculed it, and demonstrated irrefutably that both in nature and in human society leaps constituted just as essential a stage of evolution as gradual quantitative changes. Changes in being, he says, consist not only in the fact that one quantity passes into another quantity, but also that quality passes into quantity, and vice versa. Each transition of the latter kind represents an interruption in gradualness, in a Breckendiolmeliken, and gives the phenomenon a new aspect, qualitatively distinct from the previous one. Thus, water when it is cooled grows hard, not gradually, but all at once. Having already been cooled to freezing point, it can still remain a liquid only if it preserves a tranquil condition, and then the slightest shock is sufficient for it suddenly to become hard. In the world of moral phenomena, there take place the same changes of quantitative into qualitative, and differences in qualities there also are founded upon quantitative differences. Thus, a little less, a little more constitutes that limit beyond which frivolity ceases and there appears something quite different. Crime, thus also, states other conditions being equal acquire a different qualitative character merely in consequence of differences in their size. Particular laws and a particular constitution acquire quite a different significance with the extension of the territory of a state and of the numbers of its citizens. One modern naturalists know very well how frequently changes of quantity lead to changes of quality. Why does one part of the solar spectrum produce in us the sensation of a red color, another of green, etc.? Physics replies that everything is due here to the number of oscillations of the particles of the ether. It is known that this number changes for every color of the spectrum, rising from red to violet. Nor is this all. The intensity of heat in the spectrum increases in proportion to the approach to the external border of the red band, and reaches its highest point a little distance from it, on leaving the spectrum. It follows that in the spectrum there are rays of a special kind which do not give light but only heat. Physics says, here too, that the qualities of the rays change in consequence of changes in the number of oscillations of the particles of the ether. But even this is not all. The sun's rays have a certain chemical effect, as is shown for example by the fading of material in the sun. The greatest chemical strength is what distinguishes the violet and the so-called ultraviolet rays, which arouse in us no sensation of flight. The difference in the chemical action of the various rays is explained once again only by quantitative differences in the oscillations of the particles of the ether. Quantity passes into quality. Chemistry confirms the same thing. Ozone has different qualities from ordinary oxygen. Whence comes this difference? In the molecule of ozone there is a different number of atoms from that contained in the molecule of ordinary oxygen. Let us take 3 hydrocarbon compounds, CH4, marsh gas, C2HS, dimethyl, and CaH, methylethyl. All of these are composed according to the formula, n atoms of carbon and 2n plus 2 atoms of hydrogen. If n is equal to I, you get marsh gas. If n is equal to 2, you get dimethyl. If n is equal to 3, methylethyl appears. In this way entire series are formed. 1 Rasen's Chart der Logik, Part 1, Book I, pages 383-4. The importance of which any chemist will tell you. And all these series unanimously confirm the principle of the old dialectical idealists that quantity passes into quality. Hegel's triad. Now we have learned the principal distinguishing features of dialectical thought, but the reader feels himself unsatisfied. But where is the famous triad, he asks, the triad of which consists, as is well known, the whole essence of Hegelian dialectics? Your pardon, reader, we do not mention the TDAD for the simple reason that it does not at all play in Hegel's work the part which is attributed to it by people who have not the least idea of the philosophy of that thinker, and who have studied it, for example, from the textbook of criminal law of Mr. Spisovich. One filled with sacred simplicity, these light-hearted people are convinced that the whole argumentation of the German idealists was reduced to references to the triad. That whatever theoretical difficulties the old man came up against, he left others to break their poor unenlightened heads over them while he, with a tranquil smile, immediately built up a syllogism. All phenomena occur according to a triad. I am faced with a phenomenon, consequently I shall turn to the triad. To this is simply lunatic nonsense. As one of L aspiring to a barrister's career, Mr. Mikhailovsky tells us, I passionately, though unsystematically, read various legal works. Among them was the textbook of criminal law by Mr. Spisovich. This work contains a brief survey of various philosophical systems in their relation to criminology. I was particularly struck by the famous triad of Hegel, in virtue of which punishment so gracefully becomes the reconciliation of the contradiction between law and crime. The seductive character of the tripartite formula of Hegel in its most varied applications is well known. And it is not surprising that I was fascinated by it in the textbook of Mr. Spisovich. Nor is it surprising that thereupon it drew me to Hegel, and to much else. A pity, a very great pity, that Mr. Mikhailovsky does not tell us how far he satisfied his yearning for Hegel. To all appearances, he did not go very far in this direction. 2. Mr. Mikhailovsky assures us that the late Sieber, when arguing with him about the inevitability of capitalism in Russia, used all possible arguments, but at the least danger hid behind the authority of the immutable and unquestionable tripartite dialectical development. He assures us also that all of what he calls Marx's prophecies about the outcome of capitalist development repose only on the triad. We shall discuss Marx later, but of N. Sieber we may remark that we had more than once to converse with the deceased, and not once did we hear from him references to dialectical development. He himself said more than once that he was quite ignorant of the significance of Hegel in the development of modern economics. Of course, everything can be blamed on the dead, and therefore Mr. Mikhailovsky's evidence is irrefutable. The characters of Karenin puts it, or unnaturally idle talk, if you prefer the expression of Shchedrin. Not once in the 18 volumes of Hegel's works does the triad play the part of an argument, and anyone in the least familiar with his philosophical doctrine understands that it could not play such a part. With Hegel the triad has the same significance as it had previously with Fichte, whose philosophy is essentially different from the Hegelian. Obviously only gross ignorance can consider the principal distinguishing feature of one philosophical system to be that which applies to at least 2 quite different systems. We are sorry that the triad has diverted us from our exposition, but, having mentioned it, we should reach a conclusion. So let us examine what kind of a bird it is. Every phenomenon, developing to its conclusion, becomes transformed into its opposite. But as the new phenomenon, being opposite to the first, also is transformed in its turn into its own opposite, the third phase of development bears a formal resemblance to the first. Let us leave aside the question for the time being of the extent to which such a course of development corresponds to reality. Let us admit for the sake of argument that those were not wrong who thought that it does so correspond completely. But in any case it is clear that the triad only follows from one of Hegel's principles, it does not in the least serve him as a main principle itself. This is a very essential difference, because if the triad had figured as a main principle, the people who attribute such an important part to it could really seek protection under its authority. But as it plays no such part, the only people who can hide behind it are maybe those who, as the Russian saying has it, have heard the bell, but don't know where the sound comes from. Naturally the situation would not change essentially one iota if, without hiding behind the triad, dialecticians at the least danger sought protection behind the authority of the principle that every phenomenon is transformed into its own opposite. But they never behaved in that way either, and they did not do so because the principle mentioned does not at all exhaust their views on the evolution of phenomena. They say in addition, for example, that in the process of evolution quantity passes into quality, and quality into quantity. Consequently they have to reckon both with the qualitative and the quantitative sides of the process. And this presupposes an attentive attitude to its actual course in real fact. and this means in its turn that they do not content themselves with abstract conclusions from abstract principles or, at any rate, must not be satisfied with such conclusions, if they wish to remain true to their outlook upon the world. On every page of his works Hegel constantly and tirelessly pointed out that philosophy is identical with the totality of empirics, that philosophy requires nothing so insistently as going deeply into the empirical sciences. Material facts without thought have only a relative importance, thought without material facts is a mere chimera. Philosophy is that consciousness at which the empirical sciences arrive relative to themselves. It cannot be anything else. That is the view of the task of the thinking investigator which Lassalle drew from the doctrine of Hegelian philosophy. Philosophers must be specialists in those sciences which they wish to help to reach self-consciousness. It seems a very far cry from the special study of a subject to thoughtless chatter in honor of the triad. And let them not tell us that Lassalle was not a real Hegelian, that he belonged to the left and sharply reproached the right with engaging in abstract constructions of thought. The man tells you plainly that he borrowed his view directly from Hegel. But perhaps he will want to rule out the evidence of the author of the system of acquired rights, just as in court the evidence of relatives is ruled out. We shall not argue and contradict. We shall call as a witness a quite extraneous person, the author of the Sketches of the Gödel 1 see his System der Wort Second Eden. Leipzig, 1880, Preface, pp. Xerxit. Period. We ask for attention. The witness will speak long and, as usual, wisely. We are just as little followers of Hegel, as of Descartes or Aristotle. Hegel now belongs to history. The present day has another philosophy, and sees clearly the defects of the Hegelian system. But it must be agreed that the principles put forward by Hegel were really very close to the truth, and some sides of the truth were exposed by this thinker with truly astounding force. Among these truths, the discovery of some is the personal merit of Hegel, while others, though belonging not exclusively to his system but to all German philosophy from the times of Kant and Fichte, were never formulated so clearly by any one before Hegel, or expressed so powerfully as in his system. First of all let us point to the most fruitful principle of all progress, which so sharply and brilliantly distinguishes German philosophy in general and Hegel's system in particular from those hypocritical and cowardly views which predominated at that time, the beginning of the 19th century, among the French and English. Truth is the highest aim of thought. Seek the truth because in truth is the good. Whatever truth may be, it is better than all that is untrue. The first duty of a thinker is not to retreat before any results, he must be ready to sacrifice to truth his most favorite opinions. Error is the source of all that is harmful. Truth is the highest good, and the source of all else that is good. In order to assess the extreme importance of this demand, common to all German philosophy from the days of Kant, but particularly and energetically expressed by Hegel, it must be remembered in what strange and narrow confines truth was limited by the thinkers of other schools which then existed. They undertook to philosophize only in order to justify the convictions dear to them, that is they sought not the truth but the support of their own prejudices. Each took from truth only what he liked, and rejected every truth unpleasant for him, admitting without ceremony that pleasant delusion seemed to him much better than dispassionate truth. This manner of worrying, not about truth but about their confirmation of their pleasant prejudices, the German philosophers, particularly Hegel, called subjective thinking, saints above. Is this, perhaps, why our subjective thinkers abuse Hegel as a scholastic author, philosophizing for one's personal satisfaction and not on account of the living need for the truth? Hegel cruelly unmasked this empty and harmful amusement, listen well. As a necessary means of guarding against the temptation to deviate from truth to gratify one's personal desires and prejudices, Hegel put forward the famous dialectical method of reasoning. Its essence consists in this, that the thinker must not rest content with any positive conclusion, but must seek whether there are not in the subject of his thought qualities and forces which are the opposite of what this subject seems to represent at first glance. In this way, the thinker was obliged to look at the subject from all sides, and truth appeared to him only as the consequence of the struggle of all possible contradictory opinions. By this means, instead of the previous one-sided conceptions of the subject, little by little there appeared a full, many-sided investigation, and there was formed a living understanding of all the true qualities of the subject. To explain reality became the essential duty of philosophical thought. Hence there arose an extreme attentiveness to reality, over which previously no time had been wasted, and which had been unceremoniously distorted to humour one's own unilateral prejudices, dt jabula narrata. In this way conscientious and tireless search for the truth took the place of previous arbitrary interpretations. But in reality everything depends on circumstances, on conditions of time and place, and therefore Hegel recognized that the former general phrases, which judged of good and evil without examining the circumstances and causes through which the given phenomenon arose, general abstract pronouncements, were unsatisfactory. Each object, each phenomenon has its own significance, and judgment must be passed on it in keeping with the environment in which it exists. This rule was expressed by the formula, there is no abstract truth, truth is concrete, that is a definitive judgment can be passed about a definite fact only after examining all the circumstances on which it depends. And so, on the one hand, we are told that the distinguishing feature of Hegel's philosophy was its most careful investigation of reality, the most conscientious attitude to any particular subject, the study of the latter in its living environment, with all those circumstances of time and place which condition or accompany its existence. The evidence of N.G. Chernyshevsky is identical in this case with the evidence of F. Lassalle. And on the other hand we are assured that this philosophy was empty scholasticism, the whole secret of which consisted in the sophistical use of the triad. In this case the evidence of Mr. Mikhailovsky is in complete agreement with the evidence of Mr. VV, and of a whole legion of other modern Russian writers. How is this divergence of witnesses to be explained? Explain it any way you please, but remember that Lassalle and the author of the sketches of the Gogol period knew the philosophy they were talking about, while Messrs. Mikhailovsky, VV, and their brethren have quite certainly not given themselves the trouble of studying even a single work of Hegel. And notice that in characterizing dialectical thought one Chernyshevsky, sketch of the Gogol period of Russian literature, St. Petersburg, I 892, pages 250. The author of the sketches did not say one word about the triad. How is it that he did not notice that same elephant, which Mr. Mikhailovsky and company so stubbornly and so ceremoniously bring out on view to every loafer? Once again please remember that the author of the sketches of the Gogol period knew the philosophy of Hegel, while Mr. Mikhailovsky and company have not the least conception of it. Perhaps the reader may be pleased to recall certain other judgments on Hegel passed by the author of the sketches of the Gogol period. Perhaps he will point out to us the famous article, Criticism of Philosophical Prejudices Against Communal Ownership of Land. This article does speak about the triad and, to all appearances, the latter is put forward as the main hobby horse of the German idealists. But it is only in appearance. Discussing the history of property, the writer asserts that in the third and highest phase of its development it will return to its point of departure, that is that private property in the land and the means of production will yield place to social property. Such a return, he says, is a general law which shows itself in every process of development. The author's argument is in this case, in fact, nothing else than a reference to the triad. And in this lies its essential defect. It is abstract, the development of property is examined without relating it to concrete historical conditions, and therefore the author's arguments are ingenious, brilliant, but not convincing. They only astound, surprise, but do not convince. But is Hegel responsible for this defect in the argument of the author of the Criticism of Philosophical Prejudices? How, think you, would his argument have been abstract if he had considered the subject just in the way in which, according to his own works, Hegel advised all subjects to be considered, that is, keeping to the ground of reality, weighing all concrete conditions, all circumstances of time and place? It would seem that that would not be the case. It would seem that then there would not have been just that defect we have mentioned in the article. But in that event what gave rise to the defect? The fact that the author of the article Criticism of Philosophical Prejudices Against Communal Ownership of Land, in controverting the abstract arguments of his opponents, forgot the good advice of Hegel, and proved unfaithful to the method of that very thinker to whom he referred. We are sorry that in his polemical excitement he made such a mistake. But, once again, is Hegel to blame because in this particular case the author of Criticism of Philosophical Prejudices proved unable to make use of his method? Since when is it that philosophical systems are judged, not by their internal content, but by the mistakes which people referring to them may happen to make? And once again, however insistently the author of the article I have mentioned refers to the triad, even though he does not put it forward as the main hobby horse of the dialectical method. Even though he makes it, not the foundation but, at most, an unquestionable consequence. The foundation and the main distinguishing feature of dialectics is brought out by him in the following words: eternal change of forms, eternal rejection of a form brought into being by a particular content or striving, in consequence of an intensification of that striving, the higher development of that same content. Whoever has understood this great, eternal, ubiquitous law, whoever has learned how to apply it to every phenomenon, how calmly he calls into play the chance which affrights others, etc. Eternal change of forms, eternal rejection of a form brought into being by a particular content. Dialectical thinkers really do look on such a change, such a rejection of forms as a great, eternal, ubiquitous law. At the present time this conviction is not shared with them only by the representatives of some branches of social science who have not the courage to look truth straight in the eyes, and attempt to defend, albeit with the help of error, the prejudices they hold dear. All the more highly must we value the services of the great German idealist who, from the very beginning of the present century, constantly spoke of the eternal change of forms, of their eternal rejection in consequence of the intensification of the content which brought those forms into being. Earlier we left unexamined for the time being the question of whether it is a fact that every phenomenon is transformed, as the German dialectical idealist thought, into its own opposite. Now, we hope, the reader will agree with us that, strictly speaking, this question need not be examined at all. When you apply the dialectical method to the study of phenomena, you need to remember that forms change eternally in consequence of the higher development of their content. This process of rejection of forms you will have to follow up in all its fullness, if you wish to exhaust the subject. But whether the new form is the opposite of the old you will find from experience, and it is not at all important to know this beforehand. True, it is just on the basis of the historical experience of mankind that every lawyer knowing his business will tell you that every legal institution sooner or later is transformed into its own opposite. Today it promotes the satisfaction of certain social needs. Today it is valuable and necessary precisely in view of these needs. Then it begins to satisfy those needs worse and worse. Finally it is transformed into an obstacle to their satisfaction. From something necessary it becomes something harmful and then it is destroyed. Take whatever you like the history of literature, the history of species wherever there is development, you will see similar dialectics. But nevertheless, if someone wanted to penetrate the essence of the dialectical process and were to begin, of all things, with testing the idea of the oppositeness of the phenomena which constitute a series in each particular process of development, he would be approaching the problem from the wrong end. In selecting the viewpoint for such a test, there would always turn out to be very much that was arbitrary. The question must be regarded from its objective side, or in other words, one must make clear to oneself what is the inevitable change of forms involved in the development of a particular content. This is the same idea, only expressed in other words. But in testing it in practice there is no place for arbitrary choice, because the point of view of the investigator is determined by the very character of the forms and content themselves. Engels and natural science. In the words of Engels, Hegel's merit consists in the fact that he was the first to regard all phenomena from the point of view of their development, from the point of view of their origin and destruction. Whether he was the first to do it is arguable, says Mr. Mikhailovsky, but at all events he was not the last, and the present-day theories of development, the evolutionism of Spencer, Darwinism, the ideas of development in psychology, physics, geology, etc. have nothing in common with Hegelianism. If modern natural science confirms at every step the idea expressed with such genius by Hegel, that quantity passes into quality, can we say that it had nothing in common with Hegelianism? True, Hegel was not the last of those who spoke of such a transition, but this was just for the very same reason that Darwin was not the last of those who spoke of the variability of species and Newton was not the last of the Newtonists. What would you have? Such is the course of development of the human intellect. Express a correct idea, and you will certainly not be the last of those who defend it. Talk some nonsense, and although people have a great failing for it, you still risk finding yourself to be its last defender and champion. Thus, in our modest opinion, Mr. Mikhailovsky runs a considerable risk of proving to be the last supporter of the subjective method in sociology. Speaking frankly, we see no reason to regret such a course of development of the intellect. We suggest to Mr. Mikhailovsky, who finds arguable everything in the world, and much else taught, he should refute our following proposition, that wherever the idea of evolution appears in psychology, physics, geology, etc., it always has very much in common with Hegelianism, that is in every up-to-date study of evolution there are invariably repeated some of the general propositions of Hegel. We say some, and not all, because many modern evolutionists, lacking the requisite philosophical education, understand evolution. 1 Ruskoe Bogatstvo, 1894, Vol. 2, Part E, pages 150. Abstractly and one-sidedly. An example are the gentry, already mentioned earlier, who assure us that neither nature nor history make any leaps. Such people would gain a very great deal from acquaintance with Hegel's logic. Let Mr. Mikhailovsky refute us, but only let him not forget that we cannot be refuted by knowing Hegel only from the textbook of criminal law by Mr. Spisovich and from Lewis' History of Philosophy. He must take the trouble to study Hegel himself, and in saying that the present-day teachings of the evolutionists always have very much in common with Hegelianism, we are not asserting that the present evolutionists have borrowed their views from Hegel. Quite the reverse. Very often they have just as mistaken a view of him as Mr. Mikhailovsky has. And if nevertheless their theories, even partially and just at those points where they turn out to be correct, become a new illustration of Hegelianism, this circumstance only brings out in high relief the astonishing power of thought of the German idealist. People who never read him, by the sheer force of facts and the evident sense of reality, are obliged to speak as he spoke. One could not think of a greater triumph for a philosopher. Readers ignore him, but life confirms his views. Up to this day it is still difficult to say to what extent the views of the German idealists directly influenced German natural science in the direction mentioned, although it is unquestionable that in the first half of the present century even the naturalists in Germany studied philosophy during their university course, and although such men learned in the biological sciences as Hegel speak with respect nowadays of the evolutionary theories of the nature philosophers. But the philosophy of nature was the weak side of German idealism. Its strength lay in its theories touching upon the various sides of historical development. As for those theories, let Mr. Mikhailovsky remember, if he ever knew, that it was just from the school of Hegel there emerged all that brilliant constellation of thinkers and investigators who gave quite a new aspect to the study of religion, aesthetics, law, political economy, history, philosophy and so forth. In all these disciplines, during a certain most fruitful period, there was not a single outstanding worker who was not obliged to Hegel for his development and for his fresh views on his own branch of knowledge. Does Mr. Mikhailovsky think that this too is arguable? If he does, let him just try. Speaking of Hegel, Mr. Mikhailovsky tries to do it in such a way as to be understood by people uninitiated in the mysteries of the philosophical nightcap of Yegor Fyodorovich, as Belinsky disrespectfully put it when he raised the banner of revolt against Hegel. He takes for this purpose 2 examples from Engels' book Anti-Düring, but why not from Hegel himself? That would be much more convenient for a writer initiated into the mysteries, etc. A grain of oats falls in favorable conditions, it strikes root and thereby, as such, as a grain, is negated. In its place there arises a stalk, which is the negation of the grain. The plant develops and bears fruit, that is new grains of oats, and when these grains ripen, the stalk perishes. It was the negation of the grain, and now it is negated itself. And thereafter the same process of negation and negation of negation is repeated an endless number of times. At the basis of this process lies contradiction. The grain of oats is a grain and at the same time not a grain, as it is always in a state of actual or potential development. Mr. Mikhailovsky naturally finds this arguable. And this is how this attractive possibility passes with him into reality. The first stage, the stage of the grain, is the thesis, or proposition. The second, up to the formation of new grains, is the antithesis, or contradiction. The third is the synthesis or reconciliation. Mr. Mikhailovsky has decided to write in a popular style, and therefore leaves no Greek words without explanation or translation, and altogether they constitute a triad or trichotomy. And such is the fate of all that is alive. It rises, it develops and provides the origin of its repetition, after which it dies. A vast number of individual expressions of this process immediately rise up in the memory of the reader, of course, and Hegel's law proves justified in the whole organic world. For the present we go no further. If however we regard our example a little more closely, we shall see the extreme superficiality and arbitrariness of our generalization. We took a grain, a stalk and once more a grain or, more exactly, a group of grains. But before bearing fruit, a plant flowers. When we speak of oats or some other grain of economic importance, we can have in view a grain that has been sown, the straw and a grain that has been harvested, but to consider that the life of the plant has been exhausted by these three stages is quite unfounded. In the life of a plant the point of flowering is accompanied by an extreme and peculiar straining of forces, and as the flower does not arise direct from the grain, we arrive, even keeping to Hegel's terminology, not at a trichotomy but at least at a tetrachotomy, a division. Into four, the stalk negates the grain, the flower negates the stalk, the fruit negates the flower. The omission of the moment of flowering is of considerable importance also in the following respect. In the days of Hegel, perhaps, it was permissible to take the grain for the point of departure in the life of the plant, and from the business point of view it may be permissible to do so even today. The business year does begin with the sowing of the grain. But the life of the plant does not begin with the grain. We now know very well that the grain is something very complex in its structure, and itself represents the product of development of the cell, and that the cells requisite for reproduction are formed precisely at the moment of flowering. Thus in the example taken from vegetable life not only has the point of departure been taken arbitrarily and incorrectly, but the whole process has been artificially and once again arbitrarily squeezed into the framework of a trichotomy. 1. And the conclusion is, it is about time we ceased to believe that oats grow according to Hegel. Everything flows, everything changes. In our day, that is when the writer of these lines, as a student, studied the natural sciences, oats grew according to Hegel, while now we know very well that all that is nonsense. 1 Ruskoy Bogodolitvu, Eoxit, pages 154-7. Now Savon's changed out Sealan. But really, do we quite know what we are talking about? Mr. Mikhailovsky sets forth the example of a grain of oats, which he has borrowed from Engels, quite otherwise than as it is set forth by Engels himself. Engels says, the grain as such ceases to exist, it is negated, and in its place appears the plant which has arisen from it, the negation of the grain. But what is the normal life process of this plant? It grows, flowers, is fertilized and finally once more produces grains of oats, and as soon as these have ripened the stalk dies, is in its turn negated. As a result of this negation of the negation we have once again the original grain of oats, but not as a single unit, but 10, 20 or 30-fold. 2 For Engels the negation of the grain was the entire plant, in the cycle of life of which are included, incidentally, both flowering and fertilization. Mr. Mikhailovsky negates the plant by putting in its place the word stalk. The stalk, as is known, constitutes only part of a plant, and naturally is negated by its other parts, omnis determinatio is negatio. But that is the very reason why Mr. Mikhailovsky negates the expression used by Engels, replacing it by his own. The stalk negates the grain, he shouts, the flower negates the stalk, the fruit negates the flower, there's a tetrachotomy at least. Quite so, Mr. Mikhailovsky, but all that only goes to prove that in your argument with Engels you do not recoil even at. How can I put it most delicately at the moment of altering the words of your opponent? This method is somewhat subjective. Once the moment of substitution has done its work, the hateful triad falls apart like a house of cards. You have left out the moment of flowering. The Russian sociologist reproaches the German socialist, and the omission of the moment of flowering is of considerable importance. The reader has seen that the moment of flowering has been omitted not by Engels, but by Mr. Mikhailovsky in setting forth the views of Engels. He knows also that omissions of that kind in literature, 1 Engels writes, strictly speaking, of barley, not oats, but this is immaterial, of course. 2 Anti-Dyring, English Eden. Pages 154 are given considerable, though quite negative, importance. Mr. Mikhailovsky here too had recourse to a somewhat unattractive moment. But what could he do? The triad is so hateful, victory is so pleasant, and people quite uninitiated in the mysteries of a certain nightcap are so gullible. We all are innocent from birth, to virtue a great price we pin, but meet as such people on this earth that truly, we can't help but sin. The flower is an organ of the plant and, as such, as little negates the plant as the head of Mr. Mikhailovsky negates Mr. Mikhailovsky. But the fruit, or, to be more exact, the fertilized ovum, is really the negation of the given organism in its capacity as the point of departure of the development of a new life. Engels accordingly considers the cycle of life of a plant from the beginning of its development out of the fertilized ovum to its reproduction of a fertilized ovum. Mr. Mikhailovsky with the learned air of a connoisseur remarks, the life of a plant does not begin with the grain. We now know very well etc. Briefly, we now know that the seed is fertilized during the flowering. Engels, of course, knows this just as well as Mr. Mikhailovsky. But what does this prove? If Mr. Mikhailovsky prefers, we shall replace the grain by the fertilized seed, but it will not alter the sense of the life cycle of the plant, and will not refute the triad. The oats will still be growing according to Hegel. By the way, supposing we admit for a moment that the moment of flowering overthrows all the arguments of the Hegelians, how will Mr. Mikhailovsky have us deal with non-flowering plants? Is he really going to leave them in the grip of the triad? That would be wrong, because the triad would in that event have a vast number of subjects. But we put this question really only in order to make clear Mr. Mikhailovsky's idea. We ourselves remain with the conviction that you can't save yourself from the triad even with the flower. And are we alone in thinking so? Here is what, for example, the botanical specialist telephone Van Tiedem says: whatever be the form of the plant, and to whatever group it may belong, thanks to that form, its body always originates in another body which existed before it and from which it separated. In its turn, at a given moment, it separates from its mass particular parts, which become the point of departure, the germs, of as many new bodies, and so forth. In a word, it reproduces itself in the same way as it is born, by dissociation. One just look at that. A scholar of repute, a member of the Institute, a professor at the Museum of Natural History, and talks like a veritable Hegelian. It begins, he says, with dissociation and finishes up with it again. And not a word about the moment of flowering. We ourselves understand how very vexing this must be for Mr. Mikhailovsky. But there's nothing to be done. Truth, as we know, is dearer than Plato. Let us once again admit that the moment of flowering overthrows the triad. In that case, keeping to Hegel's terminology, we arrive not at a trichotomy but at least at a tetrachotomy, a division into four. Hegel's terminology reminds us of his encyclopedia. We open its first part, and learn from it that there are many cases when trichotomy passes into tetrachotomy, and that generally speaking trichotomy, as a matter of fact, is supreme only in the sphere of the spirit. So it turns out that oats grow according to Hegel, as Van Tiedem assures us, and Hegel thinks about oats according to Mr. Mikhailovsky, as is evidenced by the Encyclopédie der Philosophischen Wissenschaften im Grundriss. Marvel upon marvel. She to him, and he to me, and I to the barman Peter, Rousseau, Engels and Mikhailovsky. Another example borrowed by Mr. Mikhailovsky from Engels, to enlighten the uninitiated, deals with the teachings of Rousseau. According to Rousseau, people in the natural state and savagery were equal with the equality of animals. 1 Traité de Botanique, 2nd Eden. Paris, 1891, Part 1, pages 24. 2 Encyclopédie, Oestervale, section 230, Zusatz. But man is distinguished by his perfectibility, and this process of perfection began with the appearance of inequality. Thereafter every further step of civilization was contradictory. They were steps forward apparently towards the perfection of the individual man, but in reality towards the decay of the species. The working of metals and agriculture were the two arts the discovery of which produced this great revolution. For the poets it is gold and silver, for the philosophers iron and corn, which have civilized men and ruined the human race. Inequality continues to develop and, reaching its apogee, turns, in the Eastern despotisms, once again into the universal equality of universal insignificance, that is returns to its point of departure, and thereafter the further process in the same way brings one to the equality of the social contract. That is how Mr. Mikhailovsky sets out the example given by Engels. As is quite obvious, he finds this too arguable. One could make some remark about Engels' exposition. But it is important for us only to know what precisely Engels values in Rousseau's work, Discours sur l'origine et les fondements de l'inégalité parmi les hommes. He does not touch upon the question of whether Rousseau rightly or wrongly understands the course of history. He is interested only in the fact that Rousseau thinks dialectically. He sees contradiction in the very content of progress, and disposes his exposition in such a way as to make it adaptable to the Hegelian formula of negation and negation of negations. And in reality this can be done, even though Rousseau did not know the Hegelian dialectical formula. This is only the first outpost attack on Hegelianism in the person of Engels. Then follows the attack all along the line. Rousseau, without knowing Hegel, thought dialectically according to Hegel. Why Rousseau and not Voltaire, or not the first man in the street? Because all people, by their very nature, think dialectically. Yet it is precisely Rousseau who is selected, a man who stands out among his contemporaries not only by his gifts. In this respect many were not inferior to him, but in his very mental makeup and in the character of his outlook on the world. Such an exceptional phenomenon, you might think, ought not to be taken as a test for a general rule. But we pick as we choose. Rousseau is interesting and important, first of all, because he was the first to demonstrate sufficiently sharply the contradictory character of civilization, and contradiction is the essential condition of the dialectical process. We must however remark that the contradiction discerned by Rousseau has nothing in common with contradiction in the Hegelian sense of the word. The contradiction of Hegel lies in the fact that everything, being in a constant process of motion and change, and precisely by the consistent triple path, is at every given unit of time it and at the same time not it. LFWE leave on one side the obligatory 3 stages of development. Contradiction is here simply, as it were, the lining of changes, motion, development. Rousseau also speaks of the process of change. But it is by no means in the very fact of change that he sees contradiction. A considerable part of his argument, both in the Discours and in his other works, can be summarized in the following way: intellectual progress has been accompanied by moral retrogression. Evidently dialectical thinking has absolutely nothing to do with it. There is no negation of negations here, but only an indication of the simultaneous existence of good and evil in the particular group of phenomena. All the resemblance to the dialectical process hangs by the single word contradiction. This, however, is only one side of the case. Engels in addition sees an obvious trichotomy in Rousseau's argument. After primitive equality follows its negation inequality, then follows the negation of negations the equality of all in the Eastern despotisms, in face of the power of the Khan, Sultan, Shah. This extreme degree of inequality is the final point which completes the circle and returns us to the point from which we set out. But history does not stop at this, it develops new inequalities, and so forth. The words we have quoted are the actual words of Rousseau, and it is they which are particularly dear to Engels, as obvious evidence that Rousseau thinks according to Hegel. 1. Rousseau stood out among his contemporaries. That is true. What made him stand out? The fact that he thought dialectically, whereas his contemporaries were almost without exception metaphysicians. His view of the origin of inequality is precisely a dialectical view, although Mr. Mikhailovsky denies it. In the words of Mr. Mikhailovsky, Rousseau only pointed out that intellectual progress was accompanied in the history of civilization by moral retrogression. No, Rousseau did not only point this out. According to him, intellectual progress was the cause of moral retrogression. It would be possible to realize this even without reading the works of Rousseau. It would be sufficient to recall, on the basis of the previous extract, what part was played in his work by the working of metals and agriculture, which produced the great revolution that destroyed primitive equality. But whoever has read Rousseau himself has not, of course, forgotten the following passage in his Discours sur l'origine de l'inégalité. It remains for me to consider and to bring together the different hazards which have been able to perfect human reason by worsening the human species, making this animal wicked by making him sociable. This passage is particularly remarkable because it illustrates very well Rousseau's view on the capacity of the human race for progress. This peculiarity was spoken of a great deal by his contemporaries as well. But with them it was a mysterious force which, out of its own inner essence, brought about the successes of reason. According to Rousseau, this capacity never could develop of its own accord. For its development it required constant impulses from outside. This is one of the most important specific features of the dialectical view of intellectual progress, compared with the metaphysical view. We shall have to refer to it again later. At present what is important is that the passage just quoted expresses with utmost clarity the opinion of Rousseau. 1. All these extracts have been taken from the volume of Russkoe Begetstvo already quoted. As to the causal connection between moral retrogression and intellectual progress. 1. And this is very important for ascertaining the view of this writer on the course of civilization. Mr. Mikhailovsky makes it appear T11 at Rousseau simply pointed out a contradiction, and maybe shed some generous tears about it. In reality Rousseau considered this contradiction to be the mainspring of the historical development of civilization. The founder of civil society, and consequently the gravedigger of primitive equality, was the man who first fenced off a piece of land and said, "It belongs to me." In other words, the foundation of civil society is property, which arouses so many disputes among men, evokes in them so much greed, so spoils their morality. But the origin of property presupposed a certain development of technique and knowledge, de l'industrie et des lumières. Thus primitive relations perished precisely thanks to this development. But at the time when this development led to the triumph of private property, primitive relations between men, on their part, were already in such a state that their further existence had become impossible. 2. If we judge of Rousseau by the way in which Mr. Mikhailovsky depicts the contradiction he pointed out, we might think that the famous Genovese was nothing more than a lachrymose subjective sociologist, who at best was capable of inventing a highly moral formula of progress for the curing of human ills. In reality Rousseau most of all hated just that kind of formula, and stamped it underfoot whenever he had the opportunity. Civil society arose on the ruins of primitive relations, which had proved incapable of further existence. These relations contained within themselves the embryo of their own negation. In demonstrating this proposition, Rousseau as it was illustrating in anticipation the thought of Hegel, that every phenomenon destroys itself, becomes transformed into its own opposite. 1. For doubters there is another extract. I have assigned this first degree of the decadence of morals to the first moment of the out of letters in all countries of the world. 2. See the beginning of part 2 of Discours sur l'inégalité. Rousseau's reflection on despotism may be considered a further illustration of this idea. Now judge for yourself how much understanding of Hegel and Rousseau Mr. Mikhailovsky displays when he says, evidently dialectical thinking has absolutely nothing to do with it, and when he naively imagines that Engels arbitrarily registered Rousseau in the dialectical department only on the grounds that Rousseau used the expression contradiction, cycle, return to the point from which we set out, etc. But why did Engels quote Rousseau, and not anyone else? Why Rousseau and not Voltaire, or not the first man in the street? Because all people, by their very nature, think dialectically. You're mistaken, Mr. Mikhailovsky, far from all. You for one would never be taken by Engels for a dialectician. It would be sufficient for him to read your article, Karl Marx before the judgment of Mr. Wyszkowski, for him to put you down without hesitation among the incorrigible metaphysicians. On dialectical thinking Engels says, men thought dialectically long before they knew what dialectics was, just as they spoke prose long before the term prose was known. The law of negation of the negation, which is unconsciously operative in nature and in history, and, until it had been recognized, also in our heads, was first clearly formulated by Hegel. 1. As the reader sees, this refers to unconscious dialectical thinking, from which it is still a very long way to its conscious form. When we say that extremes meet, we without noticing it express a dialectical view of things. When we move we, again without suspecting it, are engaged in applied dialectics. We already said earlier that motion is the application of contradiction. But neither motion nor dialectical aphorisms are sufficient to save us from metaphysics in the sphere of systematical thought. On the contrary, the history of thought shows that for a long time metaphysics grew more and more strong and necessarily had to grow strong at the expense of primitive and naive dialectics, the analysis of nature into its one angles anti-diring, English Eden. Pages 161. Individual parts, the grouping of the different natural processes and natural objects in definite classes, the study of the internal anatomy of organic bodies in their manifold forms, these were the fundamental conditions of the gigantic strides in our knowledge of nature which have been made during the last 400 years. But this method of investigation has also left us as a legacy the habit of observing natural objects and natural processes in their isolation, detached from the whole vast interconnection of things. And therefore not in their motion, but in their repose. Not as essentially changing, but as fixed constants. Not in their life but in their death. And when, as was the case with Bacon and Locke, this way of looking at things was transferred from natural science to philosophy, it produced the specific limitations of last century, the metaphysical mode of thought. One thus writes Engels, from whom we also learn that the newer philosophy, on the other hand, although it included brilliant exponents of dialectics, for example Descartes and Spinoza, had become, especially under English influence, more and more rigidly fixed in the so-called metaphysical mode of reasoning, by which also the French of the 18th century, at all events in their special philosophical works, were almost exclusively dominated. But outside philosophy in the restricted sense, the French were nevertheless able to produce masterpieces of dialectics. We need only recall Diderot, the nephew of Rameau, and Rousseau's treatise on the origin of inequality among men. Point 2. It would seem clear why Engels speaks of Rousseau, and not of Voltaire and not of the first man in the street. We dare not think that Mr. Mikhailovsky has not read that same book of Engels which he quotes, and from which he draws the examples, which he examines. And if Mr. Mikhailovsky still pesters Engels with his first man in the street, it remains to suppose merely that our author, here too, has recourse to the moment of substitution with which we are already familiar, the moment of purposeful distortion of the words of 1 Ibid. Pages 27 to 8. 2 Ibid, pages 26 to 7. His opponent. The exploitation of such a moment might seem to him all the more convenient because Engels' book has not been translated into Russian, and does not exist for readers who don't know German. Here we pick as we choose. Here again there is a new temptation, and once again we can't help but sin. Oh, is it true, each god's pleasure feels when 'tis our honor tumbles, head over heels? But let us take a rest from Mr. Mikhailovsky, and return to the German idealists, and Unversich. Freedom and necessity. We have said that the philosophy of nature was the weak side of these thinkers, whose main services are to be sought in various branches of the philosophy of history. Now we shall add that it could not be otherwise at that time. Philosophy, which called itself the science of sciences, always had in it much worldly content, that is, it always occupied itself with many purely scientific questions. But at different times its worldly content was different. Thus, to confine ourselves here to examples, find the history of modern philosophy. In the 17th century the philosophers mainly occupied themselves with questions of mathematics and the natural sciences. The philosophy of the 18th century utilized for its purposes the scientific discoveries and theories of the preceding epoch, but itself, if it studied the natural sciences, did so perhaps only in the person of Kant. In France it was social questions which then came to the foreground. The same questions continued mainly to preoccupy, although from a different aspect, the philosophers of the 19th century. Schelling, for example, said flatly that he thought the solution of a single historical problem to be the most important task of transcendental philosophy. What this question was, we shall soon see. If everything flows and everything changes, if every phenomenon negates itself, if there is no such useful one, let the reader not blame us for these quotations from La Belle Helene. We recently read again Mr. Mikhailovsky's article, Darwinism and the Institution as will not ultimately become harmful, changing in this way into its own opposite. It follows that it is stupid to seek for perfect legislation, and that it is impossible to invent a structure of society which would be the best for all ages and peoples. Everything is good in its right place and at the right time. Dialectical thinking excluded all utopias. It was all the more bound to exclude them because human nature, that allegedly constant criterion which, as we have seen, was invariably used both by the writers of the Enlightenment of the 18th century and the utopian socialists of the first half of the 19th century, experienced the common fate of all phenomena. It was itself recognized to be variable. With this there disappeared that naively idealist view of history which was also maintained in equal measure both by the writers of the Enlightenment and the utopians, and which is expressed in the words, reason, opinions, govern the world. Of course, said Hegel, reason governs history, but in the same sense as that in which it governs the motion of the heavenly bodies, that is in the sense of conformity to law. The motion of the heavenly bodies conforms to law, but they naturally have no conception of that conformity. The same applies to the historical progress of humanity. In it, without any doubt, there are particular laws at work. But this does not mean that men are conscious of them, and that therefore human reason, our knowledge, our philosophy are the principal factors in historical progress. The owl of Minerva begins to fly only at night. When philosophy begins tracing its grey patterns on a grey background, when men begin to study their own social order, you may say with certainty that that order has outlived its day and is preparing to yield place to a new order, the true character of which will again become clear to mankind only after it has played its historical part. The owl of Minerva will once again fly out only at night. It is hardly necessary to say that the periodical aerial travels of the bird of wisdom are very useful, and are even quite essential. But they explain absolutely nothing. They themselves require explanation and, probably, can be explained, because they too have their conformity to law. The recognition of conformity to law in the flights of the owl of Minerva was the foundation of quite a new view of the history of mankind's intellectual development. The metaphysicians of all ages, all peoples and all tendencies, once they had acquired a certain philosophical system, considered it to be the truth and all other systems to be unquestionably false. They knew only the abstract oppositeness of abstract conceptions, truth and error. Therefore the history of thought was for them only a chaotic tangle of partly melancholy, partly ridiculous mistakes, whose wild dance continued right up to that blessed moment when, at length, the true system of philosophy was invented. That was how. B. Say, that metaphysician among metaphysicians, regarded the history of his branch of knowledge. He recommended against studying it, because there was nothing in it except errors. The dialectical idealists looked otherwise at things. Philosophy is the intellectual expression of its own age, they said. Every philosophy is true for its own age, and mistaken for any other. But if reason governs the world only in the sense of the conformity of phenomena to law, if it is not ideas, not knowledge, not enlightenment that direct men in their, so to speak, social housekeeping and in the historical progress, where then is human freedom? Where is the sphere in which man judges and chooses without amusing himself, like a child, with some empty toy, without serving as a plaything in the hands of some force external to himself, even though maybe it is not blind? The old but eternally new question of freedom and necessity rose up before the idealists of the 19th century, just as it had arisen before the metaphysicians of the preceding century, and as it arose before absolutely all the philosophers who had concerned themselves with questions of the relationship of existence and thought. Like a sphinx it said to each such thinker, unravel me, or I shall devour your system. The question of freedom and necessity was precisely that problem, the solution of which in its application to history Schelling considered to be the greatest task of transcendental philosophy. Did the latter solve it? How did that philosophy decide it? And note, for Schelling, as for Hegel, this question presented difficulties in its application precisely to history. From the purely anthropological point of view it could already be considered solved. An explanation is necessary here, and in giving it we shall ask the reader to pay it particular attention, in view of the tremendous importance of the subject. The magnetic needle turns to the north. This arises from the action of a particular form of matter, which itself is subordinated to certain laws, the laws of the material world. But for the needle the motions of that matter are unnoticed, it has not the least conception of them. It imagines that it is turning to the north quite independently of any external cause, simply because it finds it pleasant so to turn. Material necessity presents itself to the needle in the shape of its own free spiritual activity. By this example Leibniz tried to explain his view of freedom of will. By a similar example Spinoza explains his own quite identical view. A certain external cause has communicated to a stone a certain quantity of motion. The motion continues, of course, for a certain time even after the cause has ceased to act. This, its continuation, is necessary according to the laws of the material world. But imagine that the stone can think, that it is conscious of its own motion which gives it pleasure, but does not know its causes, and does not even know that there was any external reason at all for that motion. How in that event will the stone conceive of its own motion? Inevitably as the result of its own desire, its own free choice. It will say to itself, I am moving because I want to move. Such is that human freedom likewise, of which all men are so proud. Its essence amounts to this, that men are conscious of their inclinations but do not know the external causes which give rise to those inclinations. Thus a child imagines that it is free to desire that milk which constitutes its sustenance. Many even present-day readers will find such an explanation crudely materialistic, and they will be surprised that Leibniz, an idealist of the purest water, could give it. They will say in addition that in any case comparison is not proof, and that even less of a proof is the fantastic comparison of man with a magnetic needle or a stone. To this we shall observe that the comparison will cease to be fantastic directly we recall the phenomena which take place every day in the human head. The materialists of the 18th century were already pointing out the circumstance that to every willed movement in the brain there corresponds a certain motion of the brain fibers. What is a fantasy in respect of the magnetic needle or the stone becomes an unquestionable fact in relation to the brain. A movement of matter, taking place according to the fatal laws of necessity, is in fact accompanied in the brain by what is called the free operation of thought. And as for the surprise, quite natural at first sight, on account of the materialist argument of the idealist Leibniz, we must remember that, as has already been pointed out, all the consistent idealists were monists, that is in their outlook upon the world there was no place at all for that impassable abyss which separates matter from spirit in the view of the dualists. In the opinion of the dualists, a given aggregation of matter can prove capable of thought only in the event of a particle of spirit entering into it. Matter and spirit, in the eyes of the dualists, are two quite independent substances which have nothing in common between them. The comparison made by Leibniz will seem wild to him, for the simple reason that the magnetic needle has no soul. But imagine that you are dealing with a man who argues in this way, the needle is really something quite material. But what is matter itself? I believe it owes its existence to the spirit, and not in the sense that it has been created by the spirit, but in the sense that itself it is the spirit, only existing in another shape. That shape does not correspond to the true nature of the spirit, it is even directly opposed to that nature, but this does not prevent it from being a form of existence of the spirit because, by its very nature, the spirit must change into its own opposite. You may be surprised by this argument as well, but you will agree at all events that the man who finds it convincing, the man who sees in matter only the other existence of the spirit, will not be repelled by explanations which attribute to matter the functions of the spirit, or which make those functions intimately dependent upon the laws of matter. Such a man may accept a materialist explanation of spiritual phenomena and at the same time give it, whether by far-fetched reasoning or otherwise, is a different question, a strictly idealist sense. And that was how the German idealists acted. The spiritual activity of man is subjected to the laws of material necessity. But this in no way destroys human freedom. The laws of material necessity themselves are nothing else than the laws of action of the spirit. Freedom presupposes necessity, necessity passes entirely into freedom, and therefore man's freedom in reality is incomparably wider than the dualists suppose when, trying to delimit free activity and necessary activity, they thereby tear away from the realm of freedom all that region, even in their opinion, a very wide region, which they set apart for necessity. That was how the dialectical idealists argued. As the reader sees, they held firmly to the magnetic needle of Leibniz, only that needle was completely transformed, or so to speak spiritualized, in their hands. But the transformation of the needle did not yet solve all the difficulties involved in the question of the relationship between freedom and necessity. Let us suppose that the individual is quite free in spite of his subordination to the laws of necessity, or moreover just because of that subordination. But in society, and consequently in history too, we are dealing not with a single individual but with a whole mass of individuals. The question arises, is not the freedom of each infringed by the freedom of the rest? I have formed the intention of doing this and that, for example, of realizing truth and justice in social relations. This my intention has been freely adopted by myself, and no less free will be those actions of mine with the help of which I shall try to put it into effect. But my neighbors hinder me in pursuing my aim. They have revolted against my intention, just as freely as I adopted it. And just as free are their actions directed against me. How shall I overcome the obstacles which they create? Naturally, I shall argue with them, try to persuade them, and maybe even appeal to them or frighten them. But how can I know whether this will lead to anything? The French writers of the Enlightenment used to say, la raison finira par avoir raison. But in order that my reason should triumph, I require that my neighbors should also recognize it to be their reason also. And what grounds have I for hoping that this will take place? To the extent that their activity is free, and it is quite free to the extent that, by paths unknown to me, material necessity has passed into freedom, and, by supposition, it has completely passed into freedom to that extent the acts of my fellow citizens evade any foretelling. I might hope to foresee them only on the condition that I could examine them as I examine all other phenomena of the world surrounding me, that is, as the necessary consequences of definite causes which are already known, or may become known, to me. In other words, my freedom would not be an empty phrase only if consciousness of it could be accompanied by understanding the reasons which give rise to the free acts of my neighbors, that is, if I could examine them from the aspect of their necessity. Exactly the same can my neighbors say about my own acts. But what does this mean? This means that the possibility of the free, conscious, historical activity of any particular person is reduced to zero, if at the very foundation of J to R, E human actions there does not lie necessity which is accessible to the understanding of their actor. We saw earlier that metaphysical French materialism led, in point of fact, to fatalism. For in effect, if the fate of an entire people depends on one stray atom, then all we have left is to fold our arms, because we are absolutely incapable and never will be capable either of foreseeing such tricks on the part of individual atoms or of preventing them. Now we see that idealism can lead to exactly the same fatalism. If there is nothing of necessity in the acts of my fellow citizens, or if they are inaccessible to my understanding from the angle of their necessity, then all I can do is to rely on beneficent providence. My wisest plans, my most generous desires, will be broken against the quite unforeseen actions of millions of other men. In that event, as Lucretius has it, out of everything anything may come. And it is interesting that the more idealism attempted to underline the aspect of freedom in theory, the more it would be obliged to reduce it to nothingness in the sphere of practical activity, where idealism would not have the strength to grapple with chance, armed with all the powers of freedom. This was excellently understood by the dialectical idealists. In their practical philosophy, necessity was the truest and only reliable guarantee of freedom. Even moral duty cannot reassure me as to the result of my actions, Schelling said, if the results depend only on freedom. On freedom there must be necessity. But of what necessity, then, can there be any question in this case? I am hardly likely to derive much satisfaction from constant repetition of the thought that certain willed movements necessarily correspond to certain movements of the substance of the brain. No practical calculations can be founded on such an abstract proposition, and there is no further prospect of progress in this direction, because the head of my neighbor is not a glass beehive, and his cerebral fibers are not bees, and I could not observe their motions even if I knew with certainty, and we are still a long way from that situation that after such and such a movement of such and such a nervous fiber there will follow such and such an intention in the soul of my fellow citizen. Consequently we have to approach the study of the necessity of human actions from some other angle. This is all the more necessary because the owl of Minerva flies out, as we know, only in the evening, that is, the social relations between men do not represent the fruit of their conscious activity. Men consciously follow their private and personal ends. Each of them consciously strives, let us suppose, to round off his own property. Yet out of the sum total of their individual actions there arise CERTAINSOCIALRESULTSWH it perhaps they did not at all desire, and certainly did not foresee. Substantial Roman citizens bought up the lands of poor farmers. Each of them knew, of course, that thanks to his efforts such and such Tullys and Juliuses were becoming landless proletarians. But who among them foresaw that the great estates would destroy the Republic, and with it Italy itself? Who among them realized, or could realize, the historical consequences of his acquisitiveness? None of them could, and none of them did. Yet these were the consequences that thanks to the great estates, both the Republic and Italy perished. Out of the conscious free acts of individual men there necessarily follow consequences, unexpected for them and unforeseen by them, which affect the whole of society, that is which influence the sum total of mutual relationships of the same men. From the realm of freedom we thus pass into the realm of necessity. If the social consequences of the individual acts of men, arrived at unconsciously for themselves, lead to the alteration of the social system which takes place always, though far from with equal speed, then new individual aims arise before men. Their free conscious activity necessarily takes a new form. From the realm of necessity we again pass into the realm of freedom. Every necessary process is a process taking place in conformity to law. Changes in social relations which are unforeseen by men, but which necessarily appear as a result of their actions, evidently take place according to definite laws. Theoretical philosophy has to discover them. The same evidently applies to changes introduced into the aims of life, into the free activity of men, by the changed social relations. In other words, the passing of necessity into freedom also takes place according to definite laws, which can and must be discovered by theoretical philosophy. And once theoretical philosophy has performed this task, it will provide quite new and unshakable foundation for practical philosophy. Once I know the laws of social and historical progress, I can influence the latter according to my aims, without being concerned either by the tricks of stray atoms or by the consideration that my fellow countrymen, as beings gifted with free will, are every moment getting ready for me whole piles of the most astonishing surprises. Naturally, I shall not be in a condition to go bail for every individual fellow countryman, especially if he belongs to the intellectual class. But in broad outline I shall know the direction of the forces of society, and it will remain for me only to rely on their resultant to achieve my ends. And so if I could arrive, for example, at the blissful conviction that in Russia, unlike other countries, it is the foundations of society that will triumph, this will only be to the extent that I succeed in understanding the actions of the glorious Rus as actions which are in conformity to law, and in examining them from the standpoint of necessity and not from the standpoint of freedom. World history is progress in the consciousness of freedom, says Hegel, progress which we must understand in its necessary. Whence come social relations? Further, however well we may have studied the nature of man, we shall still be far from understanding those social results which follow from the actions of individual men. Let us suppose that we have admitted, with the economists of the old school, that striving for profit is the chief distinguishing feature of human nature. Shall we be in a position to anticipate the forms which that striving will take? Given definite social relations, known to us, yes. But these given, definite, known social relations will themselves change under the pressure of human nature, under the influence of the acquisitive activity of our fellow citizens. In what direction will they change? This will be just as little known to us as that new direction which the striving for profit itself will take, in the new and changed social relations. We shall find ourselves in quite the same situation if, together with the German Kathedersozialisten, we begin asserting that the nature of man is not exhausted by the mere striving for profit, but that he also has a social sense, Gemensinn. This will be a new song to an old tune. In order to emerge from ignorance, covered up by more or less learned terminology, we have to pass on from the study of the nature of man to the study of the nature of social relations. We have to understand those relations as a necessary process conforming to law. And this returns us to the question, on what depends, by what is determined, the nature of social relations. We saw that neither the materialists of last century nor the utopian socialists gave a satisfactory reply to this question. Did the dialectical idealists succeed in answering it? No, they too did not succeed, and they did not succeed precisely because they were idealists. In order to grasp their view, let us recall the argument referred to earlier about what depends on what the Constitution on manners, or manners on the Constitution. Hegel rightly remarked on this discussion that the question had been put in it quite wrongly, as in reality, although the manners of a particular people undoubtedly influence its constitution, and its constitution its manners, nevertheless both of them represent the result of some third or special force, which creates both the manners influencing the constitution and the constitution influencing manners. But what, according to Hegel, is this special force, this ultimate foundation on which stand both the nature of men and the nature of social relations? This force is notion, or, what is the same thing, the idea, the realization of which is the whole history of the particular people concerned. Every people puts into effect its own particular idea, and every particular idea of each individual people represents a stage in the development of the absolute idea. History thus turns out to be, as it were, applied logic. To explain a particular historical epoch means showing to what stage of the logical development of the absolute idea it corresponds. But what, then, is this absolute idea? Nothing else than the personification of our own logical process. Here is what a man says of it who himself passed through a thorough grounding in the school of idealism, and himself was passionately devoted to it, but noticed very soon wherein lies the radical defect of this tendency in philosophy. If from real apples, pears, strawberries, almonds, I form the general idea fruit. If I go further and imagine that my abstract idea, fruit is an entity existing outside me, and is indeed the true essence of the pear, apple, etc. then, in the language of speculative philosophy, I am declaring that fruit is the substance of the pear, the apple, the almond, etc. I am saying therefore that to be a pear is not essential to the pear, and to be an apple is not essential to the apple. What is essential to these objects is the essence which I have extracted from them and then foisted onto them, the essence of my idea fruit. I therefore pronounce apples, pears, almonds, etc., to be mere forms of existence, modi, of fruit. My finite understanding, supported by my senses, does of course distinguish an apple from a pear, and a pear from an almond. But my speculative reason pronounces these sensuous differences unessential, indifferent. It sees in the apple the same as in the pear, and in the pear the same as in the almond, namely, fruit. Particular actual fruits are regarded only as semblances, whose true essence is their substance fruit. By this method one attains to no great wealth of definition. The mineralogist whose whole science consisted in the statement that all minerals are really mineral would be a mineralogist only in his own imagination. Having reduced the various real fruits to the one fruit of its abstraction, fruit, speculative philosophy in order to attain some appearance of real content, must try somehow or other to find its way back from fruit, from substance, to the profane variety of actual fruit, the apple, the pear, the almond, etc. It is as hard to produce real fruits from the abstract idea fruit as it is easy to produce from real fruits this abstract idea. Indeed, it is impossible to arrive at the opposite of an abstraction without relinquishing the abstraction. Therefore the speculative philosopher does relinquish it, but in a speculative mystical fashion, thus rising above it only in appearance. He argues like this: if apples, pears, almonds and strawberries are really nothing but substance, fruit, the question arises why fruit manifests itself to me sometimes as an apple, sometimes as a pear, sometimes as an almond, etc. Whence comes this diversity of appearance which so strikingly contradicts my speculative perception of unity, substance, fruit? This, answers the speculative philosopher, is because the essential fruit is not dead, undifferentiated, motionless, but self-differentiating and self-moved. The diversity of profane fruits is significant not only to my sensuous understanding, but also to fruit and to the speculative reason themselves. The various profane fruits are different manifestations of the life of the one fruit. In the apple, the fruit gives itself an apple-like existence, in the pear a pear-like existence. It sets itself as an apple, a pear, an almond, and the differences which divide pears from apples and almonds are the self-differentiations of fruit, making the particular fruit subordinate members of the life process of fruit. All this is very biting, but at the same time undoubtedly just. By personifying our own process of thought in the shape of an absolute idea, and by seeking in this idea the explanation of all phenomena, idealism thereby led itself into a blind alley, out of which it could emerge only by abandoning the idea, that is by saying goodbye to idealism. Here, for example, do the following words of Schelling explain to you to any extent the nature of magnetism. Magnetism is a general act of animation, the embedding of unity into multitude, concept into diversity. That same invasion of the subjective into the objective, which in the ideal is self-consciousness, is here expressed in being. These words don't explain anything at all, do they? Just as unsatisfactory are similar explanations in the sphere of history. Why did Greece fall? Because the idea which constituted the principle of Greek life, the center of the Greek spirit, the idea of the beautiful, could be only a very short-lived phase in the development of the world spirit. Replies of this kind only repeat the question in a positive one. The quotation is from Marx, The Holy Family, Zamchovskabi, Abt. I, BD 3, SS. 228-9. I owe this reference and translation to the kindness of Miss Dona Tortrans. And, moreover, a pompous form, as it were on stilts. Hegel, who gave the explanation of the fall of Greece which has just been quoted, seems himself to have felt this, and hastens to supplement his idealist explanation by a reference to the economic reality of ancient Greece. He says, Lacy Demon fell mainly on account of inequality of property. And he acts in this way not only where Greece is concerned. This, one may say, is his invariable approach in the philosophy of history, first a few misty references to the qualities of the absolute idea, and then much more extensive and, of course, much more convincing indications of the character and development of the property relations of the people to whom he is referring. Strictly speaking, in explanations of this latter kind there's really nothing at all idealist left, and, in having recourse to them, Hegel, who used to say that idealism proves to be the truth of materialism, was signing a certificate about the poverty of idealism, tacitly admitting as it were that in essence matters stand in exactly the opposite way, and that materialism proves to be the truth of idealism. However, the materialism which Hegel here approached was a quite undeveloped, embryonic materialism, and immediately passed once more into idealism as soon as he found it necessary to explain whence came these or those particular property relations. True, here also it would happen that Hegel frequently expressed quite materialist views. But as a rule he regarded property relations as the realization of conceptions of right which developed by their own internal force. And so what have we learned about the dialectical idealists? They abandoned the standpoint of human nature and, thanks to this, got rid of the utopian view of social phenomena. They began to examine social life as a necessary process, with its own laws. But in a roundabout fashion, by personifying the process of our logical reason, that is one of the sides of human nature, they returned to the same unsatisfactory point of view, and therefore the true nature of social relations remained incomprehensible for them. Now once again a little digression into the sphere of our own domestic, Russian philosophy. Mr. Mikhailovsky has heard from Mr. Filippov, who in his turn has heard from the American writer Fraser, that all the philosophy of Hegel amounts to galvanic mysticism. What we have said already of the aims which the idealist German philosophy set before itself will be enough to show the reader how nonsensical is Fraser's opinion. Messrs. Filippov and Mikhailovsky themselves feel that their American has gone too far. It is sufficient to recall the successive course and influence, on Hegel, of preceding metaphysics, beginning with the ancients, with Heraclitus. Says Mr. Mikhailovsky, adding immediately, however, nevertheless the remarks of Fraser are in the highest degree interesting, and undoubtedly contain a certain element of truth. We must admit, although we cannot but recognize. Shedrin long ago held up this formula to ridicule. But what would you have his former assistant, Mr. Mikhailovsky, do, when he has undertaken to interpret to the uninitiated a philosopher whom he knows only by hearsay? Willy-nilly you will go on repeating, with the learned air of a scholar, phrases which say nothing. Let us however recall the successive course of development of German idealism. The experiments in galvanism produced an impression on all the thinking people of Europe, including the then young German philosopher Hegel, says Mr. Mikhailovsky. Hegel creates a colossal metaphysical system, thundering throughout the world, so that there's no getting away from it even on the banks of the river Moskva. The case is represented here as though Hegel had become infected with galvanic mysticism direct from the physicists. But Hegel's system represents only the further development of the views of Schelling. Clearly the infection must have previously influenced the latter. So it did, reassuringly replies Mr. Mikhailovsky, or Mr. Filippov, or Fraser. Schelling, and particularly some doctors who had been his pupils, carried the teaching of polarity to the last extreme. Very good. But the predecessor of Schelling was, as is known, Fichte. How did the galvanic infection affect him? Mr. Mikhailovsky says nothing about this. Probably he thinks that it had no influence at all. And he is quite right if he really does think so. In order to be convinced of this, it is sufficient to read one of the first philosophical works of Fichte, Grundlage zum 10 Wissenschaftslehre, Leipzig, 1794. In this work no microscope will discover the influence of galvanism. Yet there too, appears that same notorious triad, which, in the opinion of Mr. Mikhailovsky, constitutes the main distinguishing feature of the Hegelian philosophy, and the genealogy of which Fraser, allegedly with a certain element of truth, traces from the experiments of Galvani and Volta. Ye must admit that all this is very strange, although we cannot but recognize that nevertheless Hegel, etc., etc. The reader knows already what were Schelling's views on magnetism. The defect of German idealism lay not at all in its being founded allegedly on an excessive and unjustified captivation, in a mystical form, by the scientific discoveries of its age, but exactly the reverse in its attempt to explain all the phenomena of nature and history with the help of the process of thought which it had personified. In conclusion, one comforting piece of news. Mr. Mikhailovsky has discovered that metaphysics and capitalism are most intimately connected. That, to use the language of economic materialism, metaphysics is an essential component part of the superstructure over the capitalist form of production, although at the same time capital swallows up and adapts to itself all the technical advances of science, founded on experiment and observation, which is hostile to metaphysics. Mr. Mikhailovsky promises to discuss this curious contradiction some other time. Mr. Mikhailovsky's examination will be curious indeed. Just think, what he calls metaphysics underwent a brilliant development both in ancient Greece and in Germany of the 18th and the first half of the 19th centuries. Up to now it was thought that ancient Greece was not a capitalist country at all, and in Germany, at the time indicated, capitalism had only just begun to develop. Mr. Mikhailovsky's research will demonstrate that from the point of view of subjective sociology this is quite untrue, and that precisely ancient Greece and Germany in the days of Fichte and Hegel were classical countries of capitalism. You see now why this is important. Let our author, then, hasten to publish his remarkable discovery. Sing, my dear, don't be shy. Chapter 5, Modern Materialism. The bankruptcy of the idealist point of view in explaining the phenomena of nature and of social development was bound to force, and really did force, thinking people, that is not eclectics, not dualists, to return to the materialist view of the world. But the new materialism could no longer be a simple repetition of the teachings of the French materialists of the end of the 18th century. Materialism rose again enriched by all the acquisitions of idealism. The most important of these acquisitions was the dialectical method, the examination of phenomena in their development, in their origin and destruction. The genius who represented this new direction of thought was Karl Marx. Marx was not the first to revert